On Power. Its Nature and the History of its Growth. Bertrand de Jouvenel. 1949. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Book 6. Limited Power or Unlimited Power. A prince that will say he can do no good, except he may do everything, teacheth the people to say they are slaves, if they must not do whatever they have a mind to. Halifax, Maxims of State. Chapter 15. Limited Power. 1. Limited Power. 2. Of internal checks. 3. Of makeweights. 4. The makeweights crushed and law subordinated. 5. Unlimited power is equally dangerous whatever its source and wherever it rests. 6. Thought swings back to limited power. Lessons drawn from England. 7. The formal separation of powers. Power has two aspects, of which sometimes the one and sometimes the other is the more present to men's minds, according to the character and the situation of the onlooker, and, above all, to the circumstances of the time. It is a social necessity. By reason of the order which it imposes and the harmony which it creates, it enables men to attain a better life. These services rendered by it have made so great an impression on the majority of writers, and the idea of a governmental vacuum, Hobbes, I hearing, has filled them with so much horror, that in their conception no foundation could ever be dug too deep for the rights of power. And this held good whether its rights were derived from God or from society, of which it was the supreme expression, Kant, or the predestined guide, Hegel. These theories we attacked in Lemine, and we demonstrated that power's undeniable blessings could be explained on a quite different hypothesis, and one which had the advantage of not obscuring its other aspect. It is also a social menace. It is not a thing of reason but a living complex, animated by a dynamism which impels it to take over the forces developed already in the human congeries under its sway, that it may use them to its own purposes. The basic condition of all political science is to see power, as it were, stereoscopically, from both angles. The very possibility of such a science is, in truth, open to doubt. For there is no branch of study in which the intelligence gets so easily led astray from the path of neutrality by prejudice and interest, none in which the strict meanings of words suffer alike corruption from use in popular controversies and from the call to action which they sound, instance the words democracy or socialism, which are charged with so many different hopes as to have lost all precise meaning. To the observer who is inside the test tube and not above it, it happens inevitably that he exaggerates the importance of the reaction which is all about him, and views as an advance what is merely an oscillation. And so it happens that the solutions found in times past to the problems which agitated the finest spirits of their age are in the sequel forgotten or regarded as odious, yet their value remains. The doctrine of limitation of power is the most striking example of this. 1. Limited power. This doctrine has had a strange destiny. In the course of a single century it has burned brightly, concentrated on itself the attention of every thinker of eminence, grown in attraction by reason of the frightful spectacle presented by the outbreak of an unbridled absolutism, been the fixed guiding star of all political navigation. It has then, in the very hour of its triumph, paled its fires to the point at which what was in 1840 a truism seems today a paradox. To understand how it came into being, we must return to the ancient society of that Middle Age from which we are descended. What we find there is a complex of authorities which all limit one another. That of the king, the states in other words, is only one of them. And he, like all the others, lives in what may be called an atmosphere of right. By this I mean that certain ideas are so much the heritage of all that not even the most outstanding of these authorities is in a position to modify them, it must submit to them. So said John of Salisbury in the 12th century, the difference between the prince and the tyrant is that the prince obeys the law and governs his people in accordance with right. This formula receives its full force only if it is remembered that what is here referred to is a law and a right which issue from a source higher than power. We are acquainted with the process by which the state has grown at the expense of all other authorities. Not only has it subdued them to its overlordship, but in addition, thanks to the dismemberment of the Church, the temporal monarch has claimed to be in direct communion with the divine suzerain, and has in this way justified his assumption of a measure of legislative power, a goal towards which he had long been moving. Though the measure of it seems to us a small thing, it seemed to contemporaries a daring innovation. In this way power, which had till then been on a footing with the other authorities and the prisoner of right, tended to absorb within itself the various social authorities and even right itself. The notables, that is to say, could not maintain their position but by its pleasure, and ideas of the just depended for their continuance on its decree. Our understanding of the old society is so imperfect that we tend to regard the 17th and 18th centuries as still a time of feudalism and clericalism, whereas to contemporaries, when they compare them with times past, It seemed that the state was well in the saddle. An unparalleled concentration of functions in the hands of power was already tending to make participation in its exercise more sought after than ever before, its favors were becoming more lucrative, its mistakes more fraudulent, and its vengeance more formidable. Government is not at its most stable when its powers are at their most extended. Then, rather, is the time when it disturbs most interests, and the weight which it lays on them stimulates them to discharge, if they can, the burden onto other interests. This they cannot do so long as the strength of the government is in proportion to the extent of its claims. Their time for action comes when government is weak. Such a combination of circumstances leads inevitably to troublous times. The criticisms directed against the actual rulers, the attacks launched against the doctrines of which they make use, and the denunciation of the interests which they serve or protect, take on a tone, at any rate among some sections of the population, of hatred and warlike violence. By legal means, if such there are, if not by violence, they are ejected from their places by other men, basing themselves on other doctrines and allied to other interests, who harry, punish, and execute their predecessors, together with their auxiliaries, partisans, and colleagues. But before long these new arrivals, who are the more rabid from coming to power with fresh appetites and all the strength given by victorious passions, evoke in another section of the community a no less fanatical rage. The time of proscriptions opens. The wiser heads then bethink them that what renders this succession of rulers, their doctrines and their interests, so altogether hateful is the possibility which they enjoy of an exclusive dominion. When, for a whole half-century in England, poison, confiscation, burning, and capital punishment had been successively meted out to heterodox opinions and opposition parties, Locke, from his Dutch retreat, considered that security, liberty, and peace could be the lot of the citizen, only if power were deprived of the right to prescribe all, to direct all, and to impose all. It is the 18th century's title to fame that it tried to find means of effecting this limitation. Its jurists, to start with, furbished anew the principles of natural right. These, in the Middle Ages, had been founded on the direct command of the divine will, but this foundation had been laid in ruins by the breakup of Christian unity, the great diversity of sects, and the advance of freethinking. A substitute, though, truth to tell, a less robust one, was found in reason. The thing of importance was to uphold a legislation of universal extent, such as no human will could bend to suit its fancy or its interests. Next, Montesquieu demonstrated the need for makeweights. All history shows that every man who has authority is led to abuse it. He does not stop until he comes up against limitations. It is a hard saying, but limitations need to be set even to virtue herself. Shades of Calvin, Savonarola, and Sanju. But what is the way to get these limitations respected? Things must be so arranged that one authority checks another. 2. Of internal checks. The checking of one authority by another is a difficult conception for countries in which the various public authorities are dependent parts of one centralized machine, all set in motion by one authoritative will. Such is the structure of the European states today. In them the governmental machine was the work of the absolute monarchy, and its task is still the execution of orders which emanate from one supreme organ. Thus, the democracies which we know are in reality monocracies. But the republics of antiquity, Rome especially, were quite other. There the different magistracies were independent, and there was no concentration of the imperium except when, under pressure of events, a temporary dictator was appointed. Each office, moreover, had its own authority or potestas. The result was that the various authorities were liable to cross one another's paths and act as a check on one another. This process of check offered by one authority to another was an essential part of Roman constitutional law. One magistrate could stop another either by prohibiting a step intended or by annulling a step taken. Thus, the consul could check the praetor and the tribune the consul. And the contribution to Roman political history made by the tribune's power of check has been the most important of any. To men familiar from childhood with Roman history and knowing it infinitely better than that of their own country, the idea of one authority checking another seemed natural enough. The difficulty consisted in finding an equivalent suitable for introduction into modern constitutions. It was perhaps neither practical nor prudent to introduce internal tensions into a power which had been a unity for centuries. But Western society did, as history showed, offer the possibility of limiting power by means not of an internal but of an external check. Power could, without falling over itself, come up against makeweights. 3. Of makeweights. What is a makeweight? Clearly it must be a social authority, an established sectional interest. Such were in Montesquieu's day the higher ranks of the English aristocracy, which he so much admired, and the parliamentary class in France, to which he himself belonged. In our own time the syndicates of workmen and employers answer to the description. So do in all times the various conglomerations of interests and loyalties which arise spontaneously in society and which power seeks instinctively to dissolve. At different times it is, as is natural, different sectional interests which display sufficient character and energy to form a body and play the role of makeweights. It would be as absurd to entrust a political role to a social class which was devoid of any energy of its own as to refuse it to one which had and asserted such an energy. Interests, moreover, make themselves sufficiently prominent by their own dynamism. What Montesquieu means is that their defense of themselves, however egoistical it may be in principle, goes to form a social equilibrium, marked by the existence of makeweights which are capable of checking power. Bodies of this kind were found by Montesquieu in every part of the society of his own time. There were the nobility, whose influence had declined with the decline of their social importance. There were the clergy, also in decline, but still kept independent by their large estates and by the extent to which they acted as a ladder for the rise in the social scale of men of intellect. Over against these bodies in decline was one in the ascendant, that of the Parliament men with official freeholds, who would often turn back the royal authority. There were the surviving assemblies of the states and the provinces, who guarded jealously the privileges earned by loyalty and were sustained by a vigorous parochialism. There were besides the corporations, also in a decline, confronted now by the rising power of the commercial or industrial companies which tended to dominate the chambers of commerce and make of them their instrument. The tradition of the monarchy inclined it to the suppression of these centers of social life, not so much those which were, like the nobility, dying by inches as the more vigorous ones. The spirit of authority and centralization, which was to triumph with the revolution, was already at work. Montesquieu took advantage of a pause in this process to denounce it as harmful. Monarchy is lost, he said, when the king, concentrating all power in himself alone, summons the state to his capital, the capital to his court and the court to his own person. For him the social equilibrium is assured by incessant warfare between the various authorities. And this becomes readily intelligible when it is remembered that it was at this time that the doctrine of the balance of power in European equilibrium first saw the light in diplomacy. The continent of those days swarmed with petty states, whose lives depended on the rivalries of the larger. Everywhere one power checked another and so enabled these tiny sovereignties to live in the interstices between the great. And by analogy Montesquieu seems to have sought the preservation of individual liberty and social equilibrium. Further, just as the jus gentium, which could not by itself have saved these small sovereignties, came to invest them with sanctity and respectability, so the judicial authority furnished additional guarantees to individual liberty. The sale of offices guaranteed the complete independence of the judicial authority in its dealings with the state. The king must stop removing cases to his privy council. Thus there was to be a justice which would be the more objective, in that, laws being still few and far between, decisions must be mainly based on natural law, on contract, and on custom. Such a justice would, moreover, be constantly tempered by interpretations which were in accord with the movement of ideas. The English jury system was to be introduced, and with it the intervention of what modern sociologists would call the contemporary social conscience. The final requirement was that this justice should be put within the reach of all. 4. The makeweights crushed and law subordinated. Such an outline was the system of power which was conceived by the choicer spirits of the 18th century. They had no need to concern themselves with the problem of the formation of power. The 18th century solution of that was heredity. Nor with the problem of the formation of right. There had come down to them a transcendental right. Philosophy did no more than rub the corners off it. No, for them the great problem was that of the limitation of power, and they focused attention on formulas for doing it. At that moment a sudden earthquake occurred, political, but intellectual as well. Its harbingers had been Rousseau and Mobley. The sovereignty of the people was asserted against the sovereignty of the king, and triumphed. The old power, whose virtues and vices were, like its nature, known to all, was suddenly replaced by a new power. Among such of the men of the convention as did not merely ignore him, Montesquieu was treated with a superior and disdainful amusement. He had met with it before from his correspondent, Helvetius. "Let us not waste our time," said they, on framing an elaborate machine to check the antisocial activities of power. "There is but one effective remedy, to overturn it. What made the old power bad was the law of its being. We are only too well aware," said Gregoire, "that there has never been a dynasty which was not a race of devouring monsters living on the people's blood. The power which we are now building is one which will be, by the law of its being, good. Thus we make of government a thing commensurate with the interests of society." The problem of the limitation of power, so it was supposed, only arose from the defective solution found in earlier times for the problem of the formation of power. If the source of government is undefiled, then liberty is the offspring, not, as formerly, of its weakness, but of its strength. It is no longer power's growth that will be antisocial, but any obstacle which it is sought to oppose to its growth. Thus it happened that the enemies of power became the fanatical agents of its growth and realized in a few months the absolutism which had for centuries eluded the grasp of the monarchy. The French monarchy, said Odilon Barrot, had spent whole centuries in dissolving all the various forces in society which resisted its will, yet it had still left in being some few scattered remnants of the institutions of the Middle Ages. What next? The Constituent Assembly made a clean sweep of all these last remaining obstacles: independence of the clergy, tradition of the nobility, municipal bodies of towns, syndicates of guilds, states provincial, local parliaments, hereditary offices, all disappeared in a day, not to make way for more liberal institutions, but to enrich with their effects, and to augment still further, the central authority. So complete was the work of destruction of the makeweights which the wild men of the Revolution effected, that for many generations to come the French nation, with no other object before its eyes than the state, would come to place in it all hope and all fear, would seek unceasingly to change its ministers, and would lose in the end the instinct of association and the tendency to form societies within society, which had in other days been the precious bulwarks of liberty. There is good reason for the growth which we have seen in this universal and passionate desire for public offices, of which Tocqueville said that it was giving to politics the proportions of an industry, but an unproductive industry, which disturbs the country without fertilizing it. The growth is the natural result of the fact that in modern society the subject's condition has become, under onerous and arbitrary administration, a hazardous one, whereas the career of administrator has become a safe one. A man needs to be in the machine if he is to avoid being helplessly in its grip. Nor was that the end. There was, overarching power, natural law, which is, as was said by Cicero, valid for all nations and all times. We cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people. The men of the Revolution pulled down this sovereign law from heaven and handed it like a bauble to power. It had needed the hardihood of a Hobbes to assert that the state is the source of law, that when a republic is formed, there are laws and nothing antecedent to them, that every law, written or unwritten, derives its force and authority from the will of the republic, that is to say from the will of its representative, be he monarch or assembly, that it is by these laws alone that man distinguishes good and evil, in other words, what is contrary to and what is not contrary to the statutes of the realm. The Revolution took these principles to its bosom. Law is a creation of the general will, of Parliament, in fact, which has become in a trice the only competent authority not only for manifesting but for forming this will. The effective sovereign is Parliament, on which unlimited authority has been conferred not only to make of government a hurtful business but to crush with the whole force of the law the individual liberties which had just been proclaimed. Doubtless the men of the Constituent Assembly had originally had a restrictive intention. They realized that there was nothing a government could do except in virtue of a law, and that no law could be made except in virtue of an assent by the people. But the logical end of their system could only be to make possible any act of government whatsoever, provided that it was authorized by a law, and to make possible any law whatsoever, provided that Parliament voted it. This absorption of law within the state, combined with the destruction of the various social formations, laid the twin foundations of what has in our time been called the monolithic state. There is no authority outside the power which the state exercises, no law outside the law which the state has formulated. 5. Unlimited power is equally dangerous whatever its source and wherever it rests. This whole scheme of political philosophy reposed on a fallacy which Montesquieu had exposed in advance. As in democracies the people appears to do very nearly what it wills to do, liberty has been supposed to reside in governments of this species. The power of the people has been confused with the liberty of the people. The power of the people was but a fiction and a regime which was for practical purposes a parliamentary sovereignty. But the fiction justified the blotting out of liberty on a scale never known before in Europe. These, it has been said, were but the birth pangs of a new principle. Where is the novelty? It had already been condemned by Cicero. Its consequences had already been illustrated by sufficient examples, drawn both from ancient and from modern history, to enable a commentator on L'Esprit des Lois to write almost at the time of the publication of the Contrat Social. Whenever the governing body within a state is enabled by the possession of a majority to command what seems good to it, it becomes a despotic government just as surely as one in which one man alone commands in obedience to no other law than his own will and pleasure. Even after more than 20 years, Benjamin Constant could still not talk of the despotism of the Convention without a spasm of horror and anger. When no limits are set to the representative authority, the representatives of the people are not the defenders of liberty but the candidates for tyranny. Moreover, once tyranny comes to be, it may well be the more hideous for the tyrants being more numerous. An assembly which can neither be suppressed nor restrained is, of all possible authorities, the blindest in its movements and the most incalculable in its results, even for the members who compose it. It plunges into excesses which, on a first view, seem inconceivable. An ill-considered bustle about everything, an endless multiplicity of laws, the desire to gratify the passions of the popular party by self-abandonment to their pressure or even by encouraging them to press, the rancorous hatred inspired in it by the resistance which it meets or the disapproval which it senses, the flouting of national sentiment and the stubborn clinging to error, often enough the esprit de corps which gives strength but for usurpation only, the alternation of rashness and timidity, violence and feebleness, favoritism to one and distrust of all, the motivation by purely physical sensations, such as enthusiasm or panic, the absence of all moral responsibility, and the certitude of safety in numbers from either the reproach of cowardice or the dangers attending on rashness, such are the vices of assemblies when they are not confined within bounds which they cannot overstep. Another writer of the period concludes as follows. Too long have we asserted that opinion was queen of the world. Opinion, changing, passionate and capricious opinion, is a tyrant whom we should distrust not less than other tyrants. More, indeed, for there is no tyrant who dares go to such extremes as those who give themselves the airs of popular sovereignty. When the general will is all-powerful, its representatives are the more to be feared for giving themselves out as nothing more than the docile instruments of this alleged will, and for possessing the means of compulsion or persuasion by which to canalize it into whatever channel suits them. What no tyrant, acting in his own name, would dare to do, these men legitimate by the limitless extent of the power of society. For the increase of taxation made necessary by their requirements, they go to the freeholder of this power, to the people, whose omnipotence serves no other purpose than to excuse the encroachments of their representatives. Laws the most unjust, institutions the most oppressive, are rendered obligatory for being the expression of the general will. The all-powerful people is as dangerous as a tyrant and more so, or rather it is certain that tyranny will usurp the right which is the people's. It need do no more than proclaim the omnipotence of its people in the act of threatening it, than speak in its name in the act of silencing it. Such were the lessons taught by a generation which had learned wisdom by suffering. For a whole quarter of a century they had witnessed a succession of mutually incompatible regimes, whose only point of resemblance was in the obedience which all alike exacted, and in the assurances of zeal, devotion, and enthusiasm which had to be showered on them. The characters of men had been degraded before their very eyes by fear, which sought to avert the tyrant's blows, by malice, which strove to point them at others, and by greed, which rushed in wherever they had been struck. Proscriptions had been the lot of the proud, honors that of the renegades, safety that of no man. Danu, in the year 1819, raised this protest against the revenges which terror wreaked on terror. The restoration of the liberties of the individual is for a revolution a vain objective, at no point in its course does it return them. Ambition, greed, hatred, vengeance, the violent or hurtful passions of every kind, lay hold on revolutionary movements, and if, during the long night of disorder in which the victors and the vanquished take turns in being lost and crushed, voices are raised reclaiming order and safety, their advice is held for treacherous or untimely, the perils of the time, which could in fact be cured only by the application of the safeguards of ordinary laws, are made the excuse and banal watchword for welcoming every fresh act of injustice and disorder. For the space of 30 years arbitrary acts of every kind have been multiplied, unavailingly, to the point at which not a single citizen remains who has not, once or more times, suffered from them. Unavailing it has been, for the power to commit more goes on being demanded at intervals in the sacred name of public security. This is an instance of experience echoing a meditation of Montesquieu's. Great vengeances, and the great changes which flow from them, cannot be undertaken without placing great power in the hands of a few citizens. There is need for government to return at the earliest possible moment to its ordinary channel, in which the laws are all protective and show their teeth at no man. 6. Thought swings back to limited power. Lessons drawn from England. The thinkers of the Restoration had received their political education in the school of 25 years of despotism and proscription. The similarity in the situations confronting each sent Benjamin Constant back to the truths which Locke had perceived. The establishment of sovereignty of the people in an unlimited form is to create and play at dice with a measure of power which is too great in itself and is an evil in whatever hands it is placed. The principle of the limitation of power is rediscovered. Entrust it, unlimited power, to one man, or to several men, or to all men, as you please, whichever it is, the results will be equally unfortunate for you. You will then wax hot against the actual holders of this power, and will, according to circumstances, accuse in turn monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, mixed governments and the representative system. You will be wrong. It is the measure of force that is the culprit, not its holders. Your indignation needs to be directed against the sword and not against the arm. There are weapons which are too heavy for the hand of man. The entire work of this great liberal writer is a repetition of this one idea. The problem was to apply it. How did omnipotence rise to the top? By destroying in the name of the mass, which it claimed to represent, though its existence was only a fiction, the various groups, whose life was a reality. By making a handmaid of the law to which in former times the public authority had itself been subject. The logical way to remedy this would have been to let free associations develop, whether they were founded on locality or function, and to restore to a position of complete independence the processes of forming and administering the law. But the custodians of power were disinclined to lose the immense resources placed at their disposal by the Revolution and the Empire. In 1814 the France of the departments seemed to the Duc d'Angoulême a much easier country to govern than the France of the old provinces, which was a veritable hedgehog of liberties. The opposition, in a parliamentary regime in which it might one day come to power, was no longer concerned with cutting down the substance of an authority which it might one day hope to inherit. The social impulsion to form groups and the spirit of independence among the lawyers had been left enfeebled by a long enslavement. The thought was rather to get from power what could be had than to dispense with it. This was to be noted later by Odilon Barrot. The wider you set the bounds of power, the more people will there be to aspire to it. Life goes where there is life, and when a nation's entire stock of vitality is concentrated in its government, it is only natural that every man should seek a place in it. The circumstances of the time and the tendency to catch the nearest way brought the entire principle of limitation of power down to a formal system of separation of powers. Had not Montesquieu praised this aspect of the English Constitution in a famous chapter of L'Esprit des Lois? As it was a big, fat book, the reading of a single chapter was held to qualify for the office of interpreter. And so this doctrine, at once simple and formal, took root in the political science which was spread by the French all over the continent, that there must be an executive, a lower chamber, and an upper chamber, and then all would be well. It is true enough that English analogies had an immense influence on the men of that time. They saw in Elizabeth, James I, and Charles I the prototypes of the French absolute monarchy, in the English Revolution the prototype of the French, in Cromwell a cross between Robespierre and Bonaparte, in Charles II, Louis XVIII, and James II, they saw Charles X, and they believed that the men of the July monarchy had given France a William III, and with him the stability which England had displayed since 1689. Therefore, it was natural for them to look across the Channel for a model for French institutions. But they needed also to look behind the established powers of government to the social foundations which gave them a solid strength. The English Parliament had then been in existence for nearly 6 centuries. In truth, however, it was born along with the monarchy itself, being the child of the colloquium in which the king, to furnish himself with the sinews of action, assembled the effective custodians of the various social forces and had to bargain with them. As the small fry of the esquires and the commonalty in the various counties grew in capacity to give him aids, he made place for them in his councils. The king in Parliament was supreme because the social forces supported him, and Parliament had no need of special rights, being itself the congress of independent authorities of whom power must make request. The social importance of the peers had not diminished with time. Their special position of territorial magnates still assured them a power of the purse even after they had lost their military power. When wool was the leading industry, they were its principal purveyors. When the growth of population in the 18th century raised the price of commodities, they reaped the most advantage from the rise. They were to do so again in the 19th century from the rise in land values and from the extraction of coal, for in English law the owner of the land is owner also of what is below the land. Tied as they were to the land, they were tied also to the men who lived on the land, and in the strength of their roots in the soil lay the secret of their political durability. The system of pocket boroughs, vicious as it was, assured the automatic representation in Parliament of all that was eminent in society, for wealth took the form of estates, with estates went rotten boroughs, and rotten boroughs carried seats in Parliament. Thus the 2 chambers were in fact the organ of the actual social forces. From this they drew their strength, which they did not borrow from any form of constitution. From this again came their caution. They did not so much balance power as hem it round. Though they could have crushed it and taken its place, they refrained by reason only of a good sense of which Delhomme has come upon the secret. They saw that a power as circumscribed as this, and as remarked by all, was much less dangerous than would be its successor if it perished, for its successor would enjoy all the advantage of surprise and all the prestige of novelty. Yet the social forces, each time that they so wished, could dictate power's course, as had been seen in 1749 when they drove Walpole into war. Thus, the separation of powers, as seen in England, was in reality the consequence of a process of recoil of the royal imperium before the social forces. The institution of Parliament was the constitutional expression of forces which were in league against power, acted as its overseers and controllers, and doled out to it its sinews of action, by which means they kept it always in check and decided its course with ever greater frequency. Such was the position in the time of Montesquieu, and such it was still in that of Benjamin Constant. The profound transformation which has since taken place is another story. 7. The formal separation of powers. The mere recital of the circumstances which gave birth to the duality of powers in England reveals how arbitrary was the introduction of the system in France. In the history of France, the central power and the social authorities had never had a meeting place. The centralized imperium had lived in victorious isolation. Duality in France had not been the creation of events, it was an artificial duality introduced by the makers of constitutions. The imperium was cut into three slices: the kings, the lower chambers, and the upper chambers. But habits are stubborn things. Each slice of the serpent tended to reproduce the complete serpent. The king regarded himself as the heir of a king who was absolute, and the assembly regarded itself as the heir of an assembly which was absolute. Both of them tended naturally not to remain within the limits of the part written for them by a constitution, but to make themselves masters of the imperium conceived always as a whole. In the same way the Augustuses and the Caesars, between whom Diocletian had made so ingenious a division of the empire, never regarded their respective territories except as bases from which to make themselves masters of the undivided empire. In the event, as we know in France, the monarchy made the running by successive encroachments, and the appeals of Parliament to the people led in the end to the Revolution of 1848. The hopes to which the July monarchy had given birth can be measured in the accents of woebegone astonishment with which men like Augustin Thierry greeted its sudden fall. It had been supposed to be going to last for centuries. And there it was, dead after 18 years. Popular sovereignty had triumphed, and the problem of the formation of power was no more. The sequel was the reappearance of the fundamental mistake of the first revolution, the illusion that any power which is founded on a good principle must be infinitely beneficent. Listen to Lamartine: a strong, centralized power such as this, it is true, dangerous where the government and the people are not one, but it ceases to be so when the government is merely the nation in action, that and no more. All the same, the National Assembly, in honoring the shades of Rousseau by acclaiming the sovereignty of the general will, burned a candle to Montesquieu as well by organizing the separation of powers. Then ensued the pons asinorum of constitution makers. Never was seen such light-mindedness. One power, they said, would check another, and no doubt it would if each distinct institution was the organ of a force pre-existent in society. But if both are emanations of the same force, never. To oppose, as the Second Republic did, an assembly elected by the people to a president elected by the people was not the organization of a true equilibrium of social elements, but merely the introduction of dispute between men invested by the same authority. In the matter of equality of rights, the president was bound to win the day over a body of men with disparate wills. Taught by experience, the makers of the Constitution of 1875 no longer provided for the election of the president by the people. But in that case the chamber, which drew its power directly from the sovereign people, was bound to win the day over the president and annul his powers. There was in all this a fulfillment of the prediction uttered by Sismondi. Whenever it is recognized that all power issues from the people, then those who hold it most directly from the people and those with the largest number of electors are bound for that reason to think their power the most legitimate. The different destinies of the third element, the upper house, under different constitutions, illustrate the conditioning of an institution's political existence by the social background. It is noteworthy that the Senate in France has resisted stoutly the onslaughts of the lower house, the reason being that it was the true reflection of a distinct social force, the small country oligarchies. It is still more noteworthy that, of the two American chambers, the one which has had the greater success in creating a balance with the president is not the one which has, like him, been elected by universal suffrage. Had the latter stood alone, the president would have mastered it, as Louis Napoleon mastered the National Assembly. It is the Senate which has for many years counterbalanced the presidential authority, the reason being that, composed as it is of two members from each state, without regard to statistics of population, it is representative of separate local entities, of established groupings and the oligarchies which run them, of anything, in short, except the people. Volumes have been written on the usefulness of a second chamber in moderating the transports of the first. But, as Mill wrote, its efficacy in this respect wholly depends on the social support which it can command outside the House. An assembly which does not rest on the basis of some great power in the country is ineffectual against one which does. For this reason the House of Lords, which in the 13th century had been able to hold power in check, and at times even to keep it in tutelage, could hold back the movement of the people only so long as the Lords were still social forces and were forever admitting fresh social forces by a wise course of policy. The House of Lords has, in fact, recoiled further and further before the Commons. Indeed it saved what is left to it of its power of check only by resigning itself, in 1911, to being no more than a hindrance. Today it is little more than a school of academic debate. Constitutions may contrive admirable organs, but these get life and force only so far as they are filled with a life and force derived from a social power which it is not within the capacity of the constitution makers to create. It is, therefore, a mere conjuring trick to parcel out into distinct organs a power which derives from one solitary source, the majority of the people. So long as the pieces remain apart, there is, admittedly, conflict, but it is the deleterious conflict of the ambitions of men and bodies of men, not the health-giving conflict of different social interests. When this point is reached, there goes with the enfeeblement and the discrediting of authority a vast increase in the responsibilities of the state. But in the end, when nothing keeps the pieces apart but constitutional devices and the amour propre of the different species of representatives, they come together again in the winning organ whose absolutism is now unlimited. Power cannot, therefore, be limited by the mere dismemberment of the imperium into constituent parts each with its distinct organ. For limitation of this kind to succeed, there must be in existence sectional interests in a sufficiently advanced state, conscious of their identity, and armed with strength to stop the encroachments of power on their own spheres, together with a system of law which is independent enough to arbitrate their clashes and escape from being the instrument of the central command. The nature of this social equilibrium raises vast questions. Can it be fitted up and kept alive by legislators of vision? Or must it not rather be a situation of a kind which is met with at certain stages in the course of historical evolution, when an ascending scale of the social balance is symmetrically in line with a descending, a position which any continuation of the movement inevitably disturbs? This may happen when the scale of political power rises in the midst of social powers which were at first unbounded. Or again when social powers renew their strength against a political power in its decline. We will not now handle this problem in which are implicit the freedom and effectiveness of the human will, and, it may truly be said, the limitations of the human being. Let us be content to note that the second hypothesis would, if true, explain those brilliant appearances and long eclipses of individual liberty which strike the historian as a recurrent phenomenon. The explanation of this liberty would in that case be the momentary inability of any one of the powers it strained to impose itself absolutely, an inability which cannot last, because each of these various bodies lives its own life, some sinking into decay and others taking on fresh strength. And the precariousness of liberty would then be seen to be a social fatality, for liberty cannot continue to be, either when the family, the commune, the squire, or the employer enjoy an absolute autonomy, or equally when the state has total sovereignty. Here too would lie the explanation of the remarkable decline in the status of the individual in the 19th and 20th centuries. First came oppression by the state, following the destruction of the makeweights by the French Revolution. Followed the rise, thanks to the enfeeblement of power by its own internal divisions, of new social forces, which were at first capitalist and later trade unionist. Soon a certain tendency to oppression showed itself in some of these new forces, wherever they achieved a measure of autonomy. Then power started to gather strength again, and the social forces were attacked by the state, an attack which, at the start, had as its aim to protect the human being, but, pushed to its conclusion, was logically bound to enslave him. Again, it must be noted that power which is founded on the sovereignty of the people is in better shape than any other to fight and conquer. If sovereignty resides in a king or an aristocracy, so that it belongs to but one man or a few, it cannot markedly extend its scope without clashing with the interests of the majority, and if only these interests are provided with an organ of their own, however restricted its power, such as the tribunate in the early days of Rome, the vast forces which in this way find expression will expand the organ by degrees, just as an army which is vastly superior in numbers will necessarily spread out once it has secured a bridgehead. But with an organ of resistance possessed by a minority against the power of the multitude, the opposite must happen. It is sure to wither away by progressive stages, just as a bridgehead narrows when it is held by an army which is much inferior in numbers. We see, then, that the opposition evoked by power will be strong enough to limit it only in the case of a power which is of a minority character. But a majority power can proceed to absolutism itself. Such an absolutism reveals, by its mere existence, the lie in such a power's soul. Though it styles itself people, it has never ceased to be power. Chapter 16. Power and law. 1. Is law a mere body of rules issued by authority? 2. Of unlimited legislative authority. 3. The mistake of the hedonist and the utilitarian. 4. Law above power. 5. A period of ambulatory law. 6. Remedies against laws. 7. When the judge checks the agent of power. 8. Of the authority of the judge. 9. Does the movement of ideas affect the fundamentals of law? 10. The way in which law becomes jungle. The absence in society of any concrete authorities capable of restraining power does not matter if power itself makes humble submission before the abstract force of the natural law. The idea of the limitation of power by such a law puts no trust in material makeweights, which are in their nature egoist and may as often hinder power's beneficent action as check its malignant use. Rather, it calls into being a spiritual process to take the place of a mechanical. It takes the form of a general distaste for the rulers aroused in the entire nation, and of a prick felt in their own consciences. It may end up in the setting in motion against them of a judicial machine by which, their great place notwithstanding, they are brought to book. Beyond all question, the supremacy of law should be the great and central theme of all political science. But, make no mistake about it, the necessary condition of this supremacy is the existence of a law older than the state, to which it is mentor. For if law is anything which power elaborates, how can it ever be to it a hindrance, a guide, or a judge? The same passions and the same ideas as those which laid in ruin the social authorities deprived law of its autonomy. This process we are now about to follow into its furthest consequences, in full knowledge that the widespread feeling of the supremacy of law which haunts men's souls makes easier of achievement the restoration of its independence. 1. Is law a mere body of rules issued by authority? The man in the street, in unconscious repetition of the medieval theologians, requires of those who rule society that they be just. But what is justice? It is defined in the Institutes of Justinian as the permanent and unshakable will to give to each his due right. Nothing could be clearer than that. Each of us has his rights, which are called subjective rights, and these live and meet in an objective law, the elaboration of a moral code which is over all and which power must both respect and make respected. We agree with Duguit when he says, the end of public authority is to realize law. And when power is exercised in accordance with this law, it becomes legitimate, whatever its origin. But what, you will say, is this law? Let us see what the jurists say. The answer given by most of them is that the law is the epitome or consequence of the rules of conduct given out by the competent authority. So that, one of them adds, what is in conformity with the laws is good, and what disregards them is bad. The art of distinguishing the just from the unjust, defines another, is one with the art of knowing and applying the laws. We are now going round in a vicious circle. Political authority should be just, it needs, that is to say, to act in conformity with the law. But the law, we are told, is nothing more than the epitome of the rules given out by political authority itself. Therefore the authority which makes laws is, by definition, always just. Here is sophistry and despair. Evidently, however, it takes some avoiding, since even a Kant arrived at this all-embracing justification of power. As he writes in his Metaphysic of Ethics, the people is never entitled to resist the supreme legislator of the state, for a rule of law is only made possible by the submission of all to the legislative will. Any right of rebellion, or even of sedition, is, therefore, totally inadmissible. The people's duty to put up with abuse of the supreme power, even when it finds it insupportable, is based on the consideration that resistance to the sovereign body of law should never be regarded as other than illegal, and as involving, even, the overthrow of the entire legal constitution. For the people to have a right to resistance, there would first need to be a public law permitting it to resist. In other words, the sovereign body of laws would need to contain a provision making it no longer sovereign. The logic is impeccable. Laws are the only source of the law. Therefore, whatever is in a law is law, and there can be no remedy against the laws. Accept it, and to seek in law a bulwark against power becomes pure illusion. The law is, as the jurists put it, positive. The very essence of the rule of law, writes a contemporary authority, is that it be instantly enforceable by weapons. Law, therefore, necessarily supposes a public authority capable of compelling individuals to obey the orders given out by itself. For the same reason it is clear that law can be conceived of only in terms of positive law. 2. Of unlimited legislative authority. Must we, then, in the face of such authorities as these, renounce as illusion the idea of a law capable of checking power, and see in law merely a creature of the state and one which is powerless against its creator? Yet has not history shown us a law whose credentials are of a different standing, being founded on the divine law and custom? And even today does not the general sentiment attest the fact that anything that is in a law is not necessarily law? Let us rather inquire, therefore, how this aberration, to the existence of which we have just called so much evidence, came to be, and what produced the subjection of law. We are now at a point at which several streams of error, starting from very different sources, meet, the mistake of Hobbes, the illusions of Rousseau and Kant, and above all the transgressions against common sense of the hedonist or utilitarian school, as represented by such men as Helvetius, Bentham, and D'Estaing de Tracy, whose understandings were as moderate as their influence was great. Hobbes, we know, saw in power the only begetter and maintainer of order among men. In times before it or without it there was nothing but the brutal clash of appetites. Again, when a republic is established, there are laws and nothing antecedent to them. Further, for each subject the civil law is the body of rules which the state, orally, in writing or in any other way that sufficiently indicates its pleasure, has communicated to him in order that he may employ them to discern good and evil, evil being what is against the rules. This definition bears a close resemblance to that of some modern jurists. Given these principles, where does it all end? The sovereign of a republic, be he a man or an assembly, is not subject to the civil laws. For he, having the power to make and unmake the laws, can, when he pleases, escape from subjection to them by abrogating those which impede him in making new ones. Hobbes, at any rate, both saw and wished the consequences of the principle which he was laying down. His imagination took pleasure in a total power, and he painted its horrific features with a logician's fanaticism, lord of all property, censor of all opinion, above reproach in all its actions, since it alone was judge of the social good and all morality came back to the social good. The case of Rousseau and Kant is quite other. They carefully refrained from entrusting this unlimited legislative authority to either a monarch or an assembly. No. Such an authority could belong to none other than the entire people and, on that condition, seem to them innocuous. For, argues Kant, when a man decides on something in regard to another, it is always possible that he may do that other some injustice, but injustice is impossible in what he decides for himself, for volenti non fit injuria. From this line of reasoning, which would be in strict logic supportable if everyone subject to the laws had without exception given an effective assent to each of them, is deduced, with the help of numerous fictions, the essential justice of the legislative authority. Fiction number 1, that a people as a whole, speaking ex cathedra, can do no injustice to any man in its decisions. Fiction number 2, that a people as a whole formulates a considered determination at all. Have we not lately observed the American people, which had voted as a whole the prohibition law, giving the lie to its vote at any hour of the day or night? Fiction number 3, and a most important one, that the people is consulted on each law. That happens only in Switzerland, and even there only on certain laws. The unlimited legislative authority with which Kant and Rousseau endowed the whole of society was bound inevitably, as Benjamin Constant said, to pass from the whole to the majority, and from the majority into the hands of a few men, often into the hand of one. However, what were potentially the evil effects of this idea were held in check by the conception of society which was entertained by Rousseau, Kant, and the men of their time. The one reality seen in the entire social complex by these men of enlarged understanding was the human being, and they proclaimed the dignity and rights which were his in his capacity of man, in language of an admirable elevation. What they did not sufficiently see was that these rights of his might come into conflict with unlimited legislative authority. But it is certain that in that event they would have fought for them and not against them. Rousseau's point of view in the matter was made clear for all to see by the defense of the liberum veto which he undertook. And in the 19th century it is on the whole true to say that the separation, though inevitably provisional, of the executive and the legislature, and above all the individualist ideas which were everywhere in vogue, acted as a safeguard against the possible consequences of an extreme application of the idea of legislative omnipotence. The truth is that the various declarations of rights played the part of a natural law set above the laws. 3. The mistake of the hedonist and the utilitarian. The hedonist and utilitarian mistake is grosser. It is the end product of the rationalist crisis. Nothing, said Helvetius, is good or bad in itself. The different peoples of all ages and countries have at no time applied the name of virtuous to any actions except those which either were, or were at any rate believed to be, useful to the public. But they were, of course, often wrong on what was useful. Help was brought to them by the new science of utility and Bentham's doctrine of the greatest good of the greatest number. The first thing to do is to banish entirely the archaic prejudice of an objective morality which is compulsive in itself. It is a very old and very ridiculous mistake, said D'Estaing de Tracy, to suppose that the principles of morality are as it were immanent in our heads and are the same for everyone, and then to posit for them some kind of celestial origin, let us recognize that morality is a science which, as with the other sciences, we make up as we go along, that it is only the knowledge of what consequences our inclinations and feelings will have for our happiness. Of all the sciences it is always the last to achieve perfection, always the least advanced, always the one on which there must be the widest differences of opinion. So we shall find, if we look closely, that our moral principles are so far from being uniform that there are in this respect as many modes of seeing and feeling as there are men, that it is this diversity which accounts for diversity of character, and that, without our being aware of it, each of us has a system of morals which is proper to himself, or rather a confused mass of inconsequent ideas, which does not deserve the name of system but for all that takes the place of one. The reader will perhaps shrug his shoulders and consider that Tracy may be dismissed as a second-rate thinker who cannot have had much direct influence. Possibly, but he describes to perfection the dispersal of beliefs and feelings which followed on the rationalist earthquake. Good and evil, justice and injustice, have now become a matter of opinion. Persisted in, these opinions will find expression in laws, and these laws will be the foundation of law, by deciding what shall be just and what unjust. Tracy is aware that there is here the possibility of great confusion. Therefore he wishes to entrust to the legislator, who is primed on every aspect of morality by methodical and strictly deductive reasoning, the duty of issuing practical moral precepts, the reasons for which it is impossible to explain in detail. How are men to be got to obey them? The most powerful of all moral instruments, in comparison with which the rest are almost a nullity, are repressive laws in their entire and perfect execution. The modern problem is here posed for us. When law has ceased to be a thing in its essential parts untouchable, a thing sustained by the beliefs held in common by the whole of society, when it has become, even in respect of fundamental morals, a thing modifiable at the pleasure of the legislator, one of two consequences must follow: either a monstrous spawning of laws at the bidding of every interest which agitates and of every opinion which stirs, or else their planned economy by a master who knows his mind and will drive society to accept whatever rules of conduct he thinks it necessary to prescribe. This dilemma is the inescapable consequence of two connected facts: the throwing of all first principles into the melting pot of a skepticism which is as unrestrained as it is unmethodical, and unlimited legislative authority. 4. Law above power. Loud and clear we proclaim it, the mounting flood of modern laws does not create law. What do they mirror, these laws, but the pressure of interests, the fancifulness of opinions, the violence of passions? When they are the work of a power which has become, with its every growth, more enervated by the strife of factions, their confusion makes them ludicrous. When they issue from a power which is in the grip of one brutal hand, their planned iniquity makes them hateful. The only respect which they either get or deserve is that which force procures them. Being founded on a conception of society which is both false and deadly, they are antisocial. It is untrue that the supremacy of law can be procured by power working alone. By far the most of the work is done by beliefs and folkways, of which there must be no incessant calling in question. Their relative stability is an essential condition of the welfare of society. The necessary cohesion of society cannot be procured by power alone. There must exist, rooted in a common faith, a deep community of feeling, passing into an acknowledged ethic and maintaining an inviolable law. Power can achieve nothing of all this. Once this community of feeling is in dissolution, and law is delivered over to the good pleasure of the legislature, then no doubt power not only can but must extend. It must intervene, widely and continuously, to restore, if it can, the threatened cohesion. Thus is explained the rise of power at the time when the Catholic faith was shaken. Thus, too, is explained its further advance coincident with the effective abandonment of the individualist notion of subjective rights affirmed in 1789. While this belief in inherent subjective rights was a less effective bulwark than the Christian faith from which it was left over, yet it was very precious as against the abuses of man-made law. In France it was the Catholic jurists who first recalled to mind that there exists an absolute law, to give expression to which is the only function of laws. It was a truth which, though it had seemed self-evident to Montesquieu, raised, in our own day, a veritable outcry. So strong was the conviction that there was no institution so fundamental and no principle so primary as not to be infinitely variable at the pleasure of whatever wish or opinion happened to be predominant for the time being. It was to the accompaniment of an orchestra of protesting noises that Duguid enunciated the true doctrine of law, and its political function. Whatever idea of the state is formed, it needs energetically and pertinaciously restating that the activity of the state in all its manifestations is limited by a law which is superior to itself, that there are things which it cannot do and things which it should do, and that this limitation does not apply merely to this or that organ of it but to the state itself. It is essential never to weary both in understanding and in asserting that there is a rule of law which is superior to the public authority, a law which comes to limit it and lay on it obligations. 5. A period of ambulatory law. The conception is one which, no sooner formulated, forces itself on the mind. It alone can give meaning to what are otherwise mere games with words. The talk heard nowadays of installing the reign of law between nations signifies nothing at all if every people claims to possess an unlimited right of deciding what it will do. But, however true may be the idea of a rule of law laid on power, its implementation is in our time a matter of great difficulty. For, even if the principle of laws being conformable to a law is admitted as an obligation, what is there to prevent a power which presents a law and a group which mobilizes opinion to get it passed, from claiming that the law in question is an expression, manifestation, and realization of law? And, on my calling it iniquitous, I shall merely be told that my conception of law is false or, a still more crushing retort, out of date. Law, like morality, which is its stay, is, we are told, ambulatory, both are in continuous movement and neither, therefore, has any fixed mark. The genius of our time finds quite instinctively this repartee to the principle of the supremacy of law. Having found it, it comes to terms with the principle fast enough, even to the point of invoking it. The attack on those same individual rights which in 1789 had their sacredness proclaimed, the privileged position accorded to certain groups or the discrimination exercised against certain others, the character of uncertainty stamped on every interest, and the unconditional surrender of them all to power, all were explained, justified, and extolled as reflecting an ever more advanced and elevated conception of law. And what answer can be made? In what does the substance of law, as opposed to ambulatory law, consist? It has now lost the two stays which formerly kept it on its base, as to its essential parts, faith in a divine law, as to the rest, respect for ancestral observances. The second root could not, it is true, hope to survive in a time of rapid change. But how about the first? The man of today, owning neither superior nor ancestors nor beliefs nor folkways, stands completely defenseless before the glittering prospect, which is now held out to him, of a better state of things to be achieved, of a larger social welfare to be realized, by means of legislation, which, though it offend an outmoded law, is inspired thereto by today's better law. It is, then, quite useless to look for the defense of an unsettled law from a hesitant public opinion. The feeling of law is still alive, but it is now called out effectively only by violence in its most naked forms. It does not respond, and is quite without means of responding, to the challenge of daily and surreptitious aggression. 6. Remedies against laws. Is there, then, any way of assuring effectively the supremacy of law unless it be by first formulating expressly its fundamental rules, and then establishing a concrete authority, which will have the task of bringing laws to the test of law, and rejecting those which offend it? That was the system which Marshall, the American jurist, was able to get accepted in the United States in 1803. Against a law which violates the rights guaranteed him by the Constitution, the citizen can have recourse to the judicial machine, in the final resort to the Supreme Court. This can invalidate as respects the suit of the provisions of the law in question, which, being now inapplicable, is thereafter a dead letter. In this institution the Americans have found the bulwark of their liberty and the dam to power's encroachments. It has checked the passions to the play of which the democratic form of constitution abandoned the legislative machine. It has prevented them from using this machine to the detriment of this or that class of citizens. The proposal was made to bring this institution over to France and to make of the Declaration of Rights of 1789 the fundamental and inviolable law. The tribunals and, in the last resort, a supreme tribunal would then adjudicate between the impatient legislator and the wronged citizens. The project would certainly have tied up with the real intentions of the men of the Constituent Assembly. They are now made fun of for having inscribed immortal principles at the head of the legislative structure which the rulers of today were to build. Here, as often happens, it is the skeptic that was the fool, and the enthusiast who was the wise man. Once the decision was taken to entrust to men the vast responsibility of making the law, they needed for their guidance a fixed framework to direct and limit their activities. The Declaration was the more or less legitimate descendant of the divine law, but a much less effective one. Is it now possible to make the Declaration effective by bringing over an American institution? Let it be remembered that this institution grew and flourished only from being the natural offspring of the common law which the immigrants had brought with them from England, a law which has not, or has not for a long time had, its equivalent on the continent. If the judge in America can now rebuff the legislator who invades the domain of private liberty, The reason is that the judge in England had been able before him to rebuff the agent of power who encroached on this sphere. A judicial bit was in the mouth of the executive, and it was, therefore, logical, at a time when the legislature was taking a big step forward, to put a bit in its mouth, too. For what did it profit the citizen to be protected by a judge against an agent of power come without legal warrant, if, as nowadays happens, the agent could return the next day, and be acting this time in the name of the law? This is the danger which is parried by the Supreme Court. And, as we see, the innovation of 1803 was in line with earlier conceptions of the judge's role and of judicial authority which are, unfortunately, foreign to France, at least to the France born of the Revolution. 7. When the judge checks the agent of power. The 18th century conceived for English liberties an admiration which has echoed down to our own time, but it was quite wrong in ascribing the principle of them to the parliamentary regime. It was really embedded in the judicial regime. When the agent of power comes to lay hands on a man in his private domain, whether to force him to do or to prevent him from doing, he is backed by a complete apparatus of constraint to which a solitary individual can make no resistance. He is, if left to his own resources, a slave of power. He only ceases to be so if a makeweight can hold back the arm of government. That was the primary function of the tribunes of ancient Rome, from whose establishment the plebs dated the beginning of its emancipation. It is a task which both in England and, derivatively, in the United States, devolves on the judge. In every civilized country the judicial function consists in punishing the criminal and righting the civil wrong done by one man to the rights of another. It implies, logically, ability to take the preventive steps needed to terminate the tortious act. Now, in what are called the Anglo-Saxon countries, the right of justice to take these steps is not limited to the actions of one private individual in regard to another, but extends also to the actions of an agent of power in regard to a man in a street. A Secretary of State, said Dicey, is governed by the ordinary law of the realm both in his official conduct and in his private life. If, in an access of anger, the Secretary of State for Home Affairs assaulted the leader of the opposition or had him arrested because he considered the liberty of his political opponent dangerous for the state, this minister would in either case expose himself to proceedings and to all the other penalties laid down by the law for the case of acts of violence. Although the arrest of an influential politician, whose speeches might excite disorder, is a strictly administrative act, that would not excuse either the minister or the policeman who had obeyed his orders. This example throws into relief the essential difference between British and continental society, and makes clear what is the real foundation of English liberty. It is not where search has been made for it, in political institutions, which have been copied to no purpose, but rather in the conception of law. Political thought in France places power above the ordinary law. In that way it divides the members of the community into two clearly defined classes. All who are on the state's side of the line may proceed against all who are on the people's without becoming accountable to the ordinary tribunals. In England, on the other hand, the idea of legal equality, or of the universal subjection of all classes to one law administered by the ordinary courts, has been pushed to its utmost limit. With us every official, from the Prime Minister down to a constable or a collector of taxes, is under the same responsibility for every act done without legal justification as any other citizen. The reports abound with cases in which officials have been brought before the courts, and made, in their personal capacity, liable to punishment, or to the payment of damages, for acts done in their official character but in excess of their lawful authority. A colonial governor, a secretary of state, a military officer, and all subordinates, though carrying out the commands of their official superiors, are as responsible for any act which the law does not authorize as is any private and unofficial person. The effectiveness of these guarantees derives not so much from the sanctions which they carry as from the state of mind which they induce. The subaltern, being punishable for the orders which he executes, reflects before he executes, and the primary conceptions of the common law serve him as a measuring rod. Whatever lies outside it is suspect to him. As for his superior, the threat of legal proceedings reminds him unceasingly that he is as much a citizen as everyone else. These results do not follow when, as in France, the legal remedy, offered as an act of grace to the private person against authority which has abused its power, does not strike the actual men who have done the wrong. 8. Of the authority of the judge. The French Revolution was, as we saw, bent on destroying this precious guarantee of liberty against the acts of power, which is conferred by the judge's intervention. None of the succeeding regimes has suffered it to reappear. Today we can hardly realize its worth, for in our times the idea of the sufficiency of a law to arm the agent of power seems natural enough. And if in the United States the judge can annul the law itself, he cannot do so in England. That the power of check possessed over the executive, but giving way before the will of the legislature, could be of immense effect will be recognized by those who remember that for a long time the legislative power was feeble in the extreme or even non-existent, and that law signified a fixed code of rights which all were agreed on keeping fixed, nullius leges Angliae mutari. Nevertheless, this code of rights developed, though imperceptibly, by means of decisions given in particular cases, decisions which, under the need to decide on more and more diverse sets of facts, were brought together and created a body of precedent. It was a difficult science and made to look forbidding both by the fictions to which recourse had to be had and by the Norman patois with which it was studied, with the result that the law was to some extent the preserve of those who handled these sacred mysteries. In this way there came into being a law which drew its inspiration not at all from the specific needs of power but responded only to those of the body of society. The arcana of the law gave birth to what are called in England the principles of the Constitution, being nothing more than a generalization of the rights which the courts secure to individuals. Forming, as it does, a world apart, exercised in the grave discharge of its solemn and to some extent mysterious function, the English bench of judges has accumulated in the course of centuries a prestige and a moral authority which explain the respect in which Parliament holds what has been rightly styled judicial legislation. Parliament, though it can do anything, has observed great circumspection in regard to the law thus formulated. Upon the degree of authority and independence to be conceded to the bench depended the color and working of our institutions. And the same reasons explain how the same prestige, of which the American courts are the heirs, has caused those courts to have entrusted to them the right of pronouncing on the laws themselves. But in recent times the rising flood of laws has not, in England, spared the fabric of the ancient law. And in the United States power has rebelled against the hindrance opposed to it by the Supreme Court, which has been accused of not moving with the times. Having joined issue with power on a terrain which suited power well and itself badly, the court found itself against public feeling and, after a Pyrrhic victory, had to turn down its wick. There has been talk of its twilight. The fact is that public feeling today, which apprehends things in terms of a delusive simplicity, declines utterly to permit the opinion of a few men to act as a brake, all on its own, on what the opinion of society as a whole demands. That, it is thought, is a sin against the principle of popular sovereignty. The reason why in France laws have been completely removed not only from the control of the courts but even from interpretation by them is, as Jeannie truly said, the feeling, vague and instinctive but deeply rooted in Frenchmen, that in emasculating, even by judgments given in concrete cases and which have small validity outside the facts of those cases, the certain authority of statutory dispositions, our magistrates would in the end reach the position of restraining the supreme power of the legislator, and that in that way the judicial authority would become, merely in the process of strictly carrying out its duties, superior to the legislative, the latter being the authority in which your modern man wishes to keep sovereignty exclusively vested. The legislative authority, now regarded as the expression of the will of all, or, more accurately, of the whole, exercises a total sovereignty. Who dares to hinder it? So long as the question is posed in terms of the opinion of a few as against the opinion of all, the answer does not admit of doubt. But this misses the point, for it is not a matter of opinions on one side or the other. On one side is a passing emotion, which a government or a party can fan into flame with the greatest ease, thanks to the improved and still improving methods of agitation which are available to them. And on the other are the verities of justice, with which there is no shuffling. No doubt the slightest false step on their part gravely discredits the guardians of these verities. But they do not on that account lose their obligatory character. 9. Does the movement of ideas affect the fundamentals of law? The verities to be defended, however, must be eternal verities. The mistake of the United States Supreme Court was to defend against political opportunism principles which themselves partook of political opportunism. The founders of the American Constitution were independent proprietors and they legislated for independent proprietors. At the time of the conflict which brought about the eclipse of the Supreme Court, power had the backing of a mass of proletarians who were suffering from the consequences of a monstrously distorted conception of the rights of property. It is because it took its stand on the terrain of perishable verities that the court has seen its authority temporarily in abeyance. Similar in kind is the mistake of those who say that the natural or fundamental law should follow the movement of ideas. This high-sounding title masks in truth only the flux of interests. The various classes and social groupings are in continuous change as regards both their composition and their relative strengths. And the phrase really means that law must adapt itself to these changes. But there is in law an immutable element, and we human beings are not, as I see it, alas, equal to the task of evolving a bubbling stream of ever-new verities. Ideas are, more truly, like infrequent oases in the barren wastes of human thought. Once discovered, they are forever precious, even though they are left to be silted up by the sands of stupidity and ignorance. Where is this stream of yours, that it should cause me to change direction? A mirage. There must be a return to Aristotle, St. Thomas, Montesquieu. In them is substance, and nothing of them is divorced from reality. 10. The way in which law becomes jungle. The capital blunder of our time is, probably, this, that everything has come to be regarded as eternally abiding our question. No society, as Comte said, can continue at all in which certain fundamental notions are not accorded a unanimous respect, as being beyond the pale of discussion. And, said he, there can be no true liberty without a rational submission to the unique dominion, properly authenticated, of the fundamental laws of nature, in which is shelter from all arbitrary rule of men. The metaphysic of politics has tried in vain to give its realm an odor of sanctity by investing with the honorable name of laws any sort of decisions, confused and irrational as they often are, taken by sovereign assemblies, whatever may be their composition, decisions which are conceived of, by a basic fiction which is unable to change their nature as a faithful expression of the popular will. Can we fail to see that a delirium of legislation, such as has grown up with the last 2 or 3 generations, creates, by accustoming minds to look on fundamental rules and notions as infinitely modifiable, the most favorable conditions for the despot? Ambulatory law is the sport and instrument of the passions. The despot whom a political wave carries to power can twist into the most fantastic shapes what had already lost all certainty of form. Immutable verities being things of the past, he can now impose his own, intellectual monstrosities resembling those creatures of nightmare with the head taken from one animal and the limbs from another. By setting up a kind of vicious alimentary circle he is enabled to feed the people on ideas which they return to him in the guise of general will. This general will is the breeding ground of laws which are ever more divorced not only from the divine but also from the human intelligence. Law has lost its soul and become jungle. Chapter 17. Liberty's aristocratic roots. 1. Of liberty. 2. The distant origins of liberty. 3. The system of liberty. 4. Liberty as a system based on class. 5. The free, the unfree, the half-free. 6. Incorporation and differential assimilation. 7. The advance of Caesarism. 8. The conditions of liberty. 9. The 2 possible directions of people's parties. 10. The problem is still with us. 11. Of the historical formation of national characteristics. 12. Why democracy extends powers, rights, and weakens the individual's safeguards. Where is liberty? For 2 centuries now this European society of ours has been seeking it. What it has found has been the widest, the most cumbersome, and the most burdensome state authority ever yet experienced by our civilization. That being so, when we ask where liberty is, they refer us to the ballots in our hands. Over the vast machine which keeps us in subjection we have this one right, we, the 10 or 20 or 30 millionth of the sovereign, lost in the vast crowd of our fellows, can on occasion take a hand in setting the machine in motion. And that, they tell us, is our liberty. We lose it whenever an individual will take sole possession of the machine, that is autocracy. We regain it when the right of giving the machine a periodical mass impulsion is restored to us, that is democracy. This is all either misdealing or cheating. Liberty is something quite different. Its essence lies in our will not being subject to other human wills, in our will ruling alone over our actions, only being checked when it injures the basic, indispensable requirements of life in society. Liberty is not our more or less illusory participation in the absolute sovereignty of the social whole over the parts, it is, rather, the direct, immediate and concrete sovereignty of man over himself, the thing which allows and compels him to unfold his personality, gives him mastery over and responsibility for his destiny, and makes him accountable for his acts both to his neighbor, dowered with an equal right claiming his respect. This is where justice comes in, and to God, whose purposes he either fulfills or flouts. It is not as an element in the happiness of the individual that the loftiest spirits have vaunted liberty, but rather because it consecrates the dignity of his personality and thus saves the human being from playing the merely instrumental role to which the wills of authority tend ever to reduce him. Why is it that these lofty intentions have been completely lost sight of? That participation in government, absurdly called political liberty when it is in reality one of the means given to the individual of safeguarding his liberty against the unending onslaught of the sovereignty, has come to seem to him more precious than liberty itself? That this participation of his in power has sufficed to induce him to raise up and encourage state encroachments, which have, thanks to the approval of the mob, been carried to much further lengths than absolute monarchy could ever have carried them? The phenomenon looks paradoxical but only until it is analyzed. It is easily accounted for when once a sufficiently clear idea has been formed of the 1,000-year-old duel fought between sovereignty and liberty, between power and the freeman. 1. Of liberty. Liberty is not a recent invention, on the contrary, the idea of it forms part of our oldest intellectual heritage. When we employ the terminology of liberty, we rediscover naturally formulas which had been elaborated in a social past far distant, long before the appearance of absolute monarchy, which is, properly speaking, the first in time of the modern regimes and first set in motion the destruction of subjective rights to power's advantage. For instance, when we say that no man may be imprisoned or dispossessed unless in virtue of the law of the land and the judgment of his peers, we are getting back to the language of the Magna Carta. Or if we seek with Chatham to affirm the inviolability of the private dwelling house, we are unconsciously bringing back to life the imprecation contained in the ancient law of Norway: if the king violates a free man's dwelling, all will seek out the king to kill him. And again, when we claim the right to act as we will, subject to liability for the consequences of what we do, which is, for instance, the state of British law in regard to freedom of the press, we breathe the air of the very earliest Roman law. We form an idea of liberty instinctively, or so we think, but it is in reality a throwback of the collective memory to the day of the freeman. Unlike man in a state of nature, the freeman is not a philosopher's dream, but actually existed in those societies which power had not invaded. It is from him that we derive our notion of individual rights. All we have forgotten is how they were hedged around and defended. We have become so inured to power that we have now come to regard our liberties as held in grant from it. But viewed historically, the right to liberty was not an act of generosity on the part of power, its birth was of another kind. And the chief clash with our modern ideas lies in this, that in the past this right was not of general extent, based on the hypothesis that there was in each man a dignity which power had on principle to respect. It was the personal right of certain men, the fruit of a dignity to which they had enforced respect. Liberty was an achievement, which won the name of subjective right by self-assertion. It is against this historical background that liberty must be viewed if we are to see its problem aright. 2. The distant origins of liberty. Liberty is found among the most ancient groupings of the Indo-European people known to us. It is a subjective right which belongs to those, and to those only, who are capable of defending it, to the members, that is to say, of certain virile families which have, with a view to forming a society, entered into a sort of federation. Whoever belongs to one of these families is free, because he has brothers to defend him or avenge him. These can, if he has suffered injury or death, beleaguer in arms the dwelling place of the murderer. They can also, when he is the accused, range themselves at his side. In this powerful family solidarity all the most ancient forms of procedure find their explanation. As, for example, the manner of serving a writ, the record of which is preserved for us in the laws of Alfred. Acceptance of service was obtained by a mimic assault on the defendant's house, a clear indication of the fact that a suit was at first a recourse to arbitration held with a view to obviating a physical combat. It also explains why the suit took the form of a piling up of oath against oath, with that suitor winning the day who could bring up the larger reserves of sworn men to put their hands under his and swear in his behalf. It was an obvious trial of strength, in which the more numerous and united family was bound to carry the day. It was these powerful families, jealous of their independence but assiduous in matters of common import, that gave their tone to libertarian institutions. Unwilling at first to accept a leader at all except when circumstances made one necessary, they ended in submission to a regular government, but always refused to admit that anything other than their express consent tied them to it. All the authority, strength, and resources at power's command were those which were lent to it by assemblies of freemen. Life in cities disintegrated the clans progressively into families in the strict sense, but the chiefs still embodied the fierce spirit of independence which marked the beginnings of society. Witness the most ancient Roman law, which was built on the principle of the autonomy of the individual will. 3. The system of liberty. To us it is hardly credible that a society can remain alive in which each man is the judge and master of his own actions, and our first reaction is that the most hideous disorder must reign wherever there is no power to dictate to men their behavior. Patrician Rome is evidence to the contrary. It offers us the spectacle of a continuing gravity and seemliness which suffered no decline until after a lapse of centuries, and disorder set in at the very time that rules started to multiply. Why is it that the autonomy of individual wills did not produce what seemed to us its natural results? The answer lies in 3 words: responsibility, ritual, folkways. The Roman was, it is true, free to do anything. But let him have answered imprudently the question spondon? And he was bound, that he misunderstood, that he was deceived or even coerced, helped him nothing. There was no coercing a man, etiam si coactus, etam involut. He was free, but, through carelessness, imprudence, or stupidity, he promised to pay a certain sum, and cannot, behold him now the slave of his creditor. A world in which the consequences of mistakes were liable to be so heavy both required and formed virile natures. Men meditated long their actions, and, as though to induce reflection, their every action wore a ceremonial aspect. All might be done, the sale of a son or the substitution for him in the inheritance of a stranger in blood, but the necessary ritual had to be observed. At the height of Republican Rome this ritual was strict in the extreme, and brought it home to men that their decisions and acts were grave and solemn things. It gave to their steps a measured and majestic gait. Unquestionably nothing did more to give to the Senate its air of an assemblage of kings. Finally we come to the essential factor in the ordering of society, to the folkways. The early imprinting on the mind by a feared and venerated father of the cult of the ancestors, a severe and uniform education, the formation in common of adolescent training centers, the early spectacle of behavior commanding respect, this and all else conditioned freemen to certain modes of behavior. Should they fall short, whether through whim or weakness, there fell on them the force of public censure, which checked their careers and might even go so far as to deprive them of their status of freemen. The reason why Plutarch makes such elevating reading is that his characters, from the best to the worst, play their parts one and all without commonness or meanness. It is not surprising that they have furnished tragedy with almost all its heroes, for, even while they were alive, they were in some sense already on the stage, trained to play certain characters and fixed in their parts by the exacting expectations of the spectators. The climate of opinion when Republican Rome stood at its summit was that of a small, privileged society, freed from all menial work and sordid preoccupation and nurtured on tales of heroic exploit, a betrayal of this standard, and its doors closed forever against the offender. Let us remark in passing that it was because the political thinkers of the 18th century conceived of opinion after these classical models that they sought to entrust it with so large a part. They failed to notice that the object of their admiration was neither general nor natural, that it was the opinion of a class and a product of meticulous training. 4. Liberty as a system based on class. The system of liberty rested entirely in those days on the assumption that men would use their liberty in a certain way. This assumption implied no estimate of the nature of man as such. Speculations of that kind made their appearance only when Greek civilization was in decline, and came to Rome as an importation from abroad. Reliance was placed on the observable fact that men, that is to say, of a certain class, in virtue of acquired characteristics which could be maintained in vigor, behaved for all practical purposes in this particular way. With them, and for them, the system of liberty was workable. It was a system based on class. There lies the gulf which separates the city of antiquity from the state of today, ancient thought from modern. The word freeman does not sound to our ear as it did to those of the men of old. The emphasis is, for us, entirely on the man. In it is the substance, and the adjective is a mere redundancy which only develops an idea already contained in the noun, whereas for the Romans the emphasis was on the free, so much so that they telescoped the noun and the adjective into a single noun, ingenuous. The freeman is a man of a particular kind, and has, if we are to accept Aristotle, a particular sort of nature. It is to this nature that the privileges of liberty are linked. The moment a man belies it, they are lost to him, as, for instance, to the Roman who let himself be taken prisoner in war, or became a notorious evildoer, or, for the sake of security, placed himself in another man's power. Freemen are, taken as a body, capable both of ruling others and of agreeing among themselves, and rest their pride simultaneously in the majesty of their own persons and in that of the city. Men of their breed, whether Spartiates or Romans, will never submit to slavery whether from within or from without. They put up a superb resistance to the aggressions of power-seeking expansion, while bringing to the discipline and defense of society a proud and assiduous succor. They are the soul of the Republic, or rather they are the entire Republic. But what about the rest? It is passing strange that our philosophers of the revolutionary period should have formed their conception of a free society by reference to societies where everyone was not free, where, in fact, the vast majority were not free. It is no less strange that they never stopped to ask whether perhaps the characters which they so much admired were not made possible by the existence of a class which was not free. Rousseau, in whose philosophy were many things, was fully conscious of this difficulty. Must we say that liberty is possible only on a basis of slavery? Perhaps we must. 5. The free, the unfree, the half-free. The system of liberty in the ancient world rested on a social differentiation which the modern spirit finds profoundly shocking. At Athens there were from 15 to 20,000 free citizens, as against 400,000 slaves. And the slavery was, even in the eyes of the philosophers, The condition of the freedom, a section of humanity had to be tools. The usefulness of slaves diverges little from that of animals, said Aristotle. Bodily service for the necessities of life is forthcoming from both. It is thanks to them alone that freemen had the leisure to raise themselves to the true condition of man, as it was defined by Cicero. The name of man is generally bestowed but is in fact earned only by those who cultivate knowledge. But, even so, the position at Athens in the time of Aristotle and at Rome in the time of Cicero, in which a large class of freemen rested on a bed of slaves, marked a stage in a long trail of generalization of liberty. It is far from the case that in the epoch in which liberty glittered most brilliantly all who were not slaves were free. Full liberty belonged only to some, but there were many who enjoyed what was called by Mommsen half-liberty. Full civil and political rights were at first the portion only of the Eupatrids or the patricians, members at one and the same time both of the founding families or clans and of the warrior bands in whose assemblage the strength of society consisted. The phratries and curias kept alive the memory of these bands. The plebeians who lay outside these categories, or enter them only in the capacity of dependents, were not citizens and freemen in the true sense. Naturally, the mass of plebeians brought social pressure to bear on the privileged aristocracy, and this pressure had the effect of diffusing the system of liberty, though it also altered its characteristics. To us, who are not satisfied with a liberty that is undiffused, this pressure, and its diverse forms and consequences, which are not, as we shall see, what was intended, are full of valuable lessons. 6. Incorporation and differential assimilation. Out of an extremely complex process, one on which historians have been too silent, it is only possible here to disengage the three main forms of emancipation, to which we shall give the names of incorporation, differential assimilation, and counter-organization. The result was that, instead of virile plebeian families coming in to enlarge and fortify the patriciate, they remained part of the plebs, gave it its leaders, and conducted a long drawn-out political warfare, in the course of which the right of plebeians to hold the various public offices was progressively recognized. Then these plebeian families, in the pride of offices held and administered, joined up with the patriciate to form a new governing class, the nobilitas, which presided over the destinies of Rome in the most glorious hours of her history. In the course of its struggles with the patriciate the condition of the plebs changed, for it won for itself civil and political rights. These were not, properly speaking, the patrician rights, and this is why the expression differential assimilation has been used. For instance, the form of patrician marriage, the conferratio, was bound up with rights which were purely patrician. Other forms of marriage had, therefore, to be found. Again, the manner of making a will by means of a solemn declaration of testamentary intentions made before the comitia curiata was unsuited to the plebeian, so there was invented the disposition by way of a fictitious sale of the estate. All these forms of plebeian usage were, moreover, of greater practical convenience than the ancient forms, which were in the end to be abandoned even by the patricians themselves. The spirit of the law underwent a change. So long as Roman society was powerfully organized in private groupings, each of them presided over by a man of strong will, whose will had been disciplined by beliefs and folkways, all the law that was necessary was to keep some sort of watch on the various crossroads at which collisions were possible. But behavior became less calculable when it was a case of a crowd of men whose wills had received less conditioning. Weaker characters, of men who had not previously enjoyed complete autonomy as regards law, could not be made subject to the cruel consequences of mistakes, which would be more frequent. It became necessary to temper and humanize the law. Public authority, in the form of the praetor, was brought in to protect individuals. Regulations multiplied under it. Nor was that all. Primitive law could do without means of coercion. Judgment was an arbitral award accepted in advance. May noted the entire absence of sanctions in the earliest systems of law. Now, when it was in operation over a wider area, justice acted in a sovereign rather than in a mediatory capacity. She needed the wherewithal to execute her will. Liberty, now cut to the habits of more people, lost something of its primitive stiffness and haughtiness. Yet it still reigned, though the phenomenon that was to destroy it was already forming. 7. The advance of Caesarism. The acquisition of civil and political rights was a very big thing for the plebeian. It was a big enough one even for the strong characters and bold spirits who had made their own way and founded powerful families, thereby putting into the shade many enfeebled patricians and gathering about them in their turn a numerous retinue of dependents. In law there was, it is true, no longer a plebs, but there was still one in fact. In the mistress of the world that was now Rome, inequality of conditions took a form far different from that taken in the days when even the proudest patricians were no more than swollen peasants. Prodigious fortunes were now amassed, to which the inviolability of individual rights gave the same protection as formerly it gave to the peasant's field. The men of the people came thereby to set less store by their legal status of freemen than by their participation in the public authority. By means of the first, whether through their own fault or that of circumstances, they could not make progress adequate to their situation. The second was to be their instrument, and they were to make such use of it as would destroy liberty itself, their own along with that of the mighty who kept them down. The tribunate and the plebiscite would, between them, produce this result. In the time when the plebeian had no rights, he had obtained, by means of the celebrated secession of the plebeians to the Aventine, the institution of inviolable tribunes, armed with complete powers for protecting him and with the right to halt for his behoof any activity of the government. This tribunician power had about it an arbitrary character which was necessary at first to make up for the plebeian's lack of rights. It should, logically, have disappeared as soon as equality of rights had been realized. Far from that, however, it continued in existence, backed by the Senate, which made clever use of it to check the designs of magistrates who were too independent, and to concentrate finally in its own hands all public authority. The Senate permitted the tribunes to unite the plebs as a separate community within the city, and to arrange for it to pass by vote resolutions of its own, plebiscita, resolutions which acquired in the end the status of laws in the true sense. These laws were very different both in intent and content from those which had in former days been presented by the magistrates, the Senate consenting. The latter had been limited to the formulation of general principles. The tribunician plebiscites, products for the most part of the needs or passions of the passing hour, came often into conflict with the most fundamental principles of the law. In this way there was introduced into Roman society the essentially erroneous notion that it is the business of legislative authority to prescribe or forbid anything whatever. Anyone who put forward a proposition of a nature seemingly advantageous for the immediate future was blindly applauded, even though his proposition subverted the entire permanent edifice of order. It was the tribunate which habituated the people to the idea of a savior redressing at a stroke the social balance. Marius and Caesar were to be its heirs, and the emperors would find it an easy task to establish themselves on the ruins of the republic and liberty. And who were the men who would try to stay this process? Freemen of the old school. Brutus's dagger, so dear to the Jacobin heart, was wielded by an aristocratic hand. 8. The conditions of liberty. The death or the Roman Republic may be ascribed with equal truth either to the fault of the masses or to the failure of the great. The system of civil and political liberty could be made to work so long as it was not extended beyond men whose folkways accorded with it. But it ceased to be workable when once it had come to include strata of men for whom liberty was as nothing beside political authority, who expected nothing from the one and hoped everything of the other. So far the responsibility for error is that of the masses. But that of the great is just as heavy. They had changed from the austere patricians of old into greedy capitalists, enriched by the pillage of whole provinces, by the illegal occupation of conquered territories, and by the squalid practice of usury. There were those who, like a certain Caecilius Clodius, had come to possess 3,600 pairs of oxen and 257,000 head of cattle. As absences on military service ruined the small proprietors, the capitalists acquired their land, and, an eloquent symbol, this ruined the once fertile soil by periodical changes of pasture for their vast herds of cattle, to such an extent that it was to be out of cultivation for nearly 2,000 years. It thus appears how right Tiberius Crackus was in seeking to limit the large and multiply the small estates, thus tightening the dangerously relaxed bonds of the social order. In so doing he hit on a fundamental truth, on what may truly be called the secret of liberty. A libertarian regime, one, that is to say, in which subjective rights are inviolable, cannot be maintained if the majority of those members of society who take a part in politics are not concerned to keep them intact. How can they be made concerned? By all the citizens having interests, not, it is true, of the same extent, but at least of the same kind and not differing, too widely in degree, interests which all are glad to see protected by the same rights. In the heyday of the Republic the more fortunate citizens had been able without occasioning discontent to predominate at the elections, just as in war they were in the forefront of the battle. The reason was that their interests, though large, were not different in kind from the smaller ones of their neighbors. But this natural harmony could endure only so long as the material conditions of life stretched in an uninterrupted chain from highest to lowest, a chain in which the various links were not too far apart. It was utterly destroyed when there came to be at one end of the social ladder a disinherited mass, and at the other an insolent plutocracy. The subjective rights, regarded as legitimate when all that they included was the modest holding of acquirers, came to inspire hatred when immense fortunes, however acquired, however large, and however used, sheltered beneath them. Thereafter the social pressures were directed against just those individual rights which should have been dear to each single member of the body politic, but had in fact come to be regarded by most of them as a mere blind, as the jealously guarded abuse of a small minority. From that time the majority labored for the destruction of those rights. And liberty foundered with them. 9. The two possible directions of people's parties. It would be an error, disastrous alike to intelligent historiography and to the formation of political science, to confound in one and the same bland admiration everyone who has espoused the popular cause, without distinguishing the two ways of serving it and the two roads along which, in pursuit of this end, society can be brought. The situation to be coped with is the same, whichever way is taken. It is the vast gulf set between the legal status and the economic status of the ordinary man. Whereas at Rome, in the first period of growth, economic independence and personal autonomy in matters of everyday life had gone on broadening down at the same pace as the right to political liberty, or even at a faster pace, a second phase arrived in which this independence and this autonomy started contracting, while the right to liberty continued to be extended to those members of society who were as yet without it, instance the admission to citizenship by Marius of the Caput Censi. In this way a position was reached in which a large crowd of individuals, weak and wretched in isolation, had at their collective disposal a great influence on public affairs. Naturally financial advances were made to this influence by the plutocratic factions. But in the end, as was certain to happen, it was caught by the popular leaders. When that point had been reached, there were two courses open to the popular leaders. The first was that of Tiberius Crackus. To him it seemed that the spirit of citizenship, the will to safeguard and defend common interests and sentiments, gets at once lost sight of both at the top and at the bottom when the capitalists have too much to defend and the proletarians not enough. Therefore he sought to re-establish as between citizens a real similitude, together with the solidarity which flows from it, to put an end to the existence side by side of a plutocracy and a proletariat, and to arrange matters so that each single citizen could enjoy effectively an independence and an autonomy such as would bind all together in defense of the system of liberty. The second course, to which Gaius Gracchus allowed himself to be committed by the failure of his brother, was quite different. To him the monstrous individual strength of the grandees and the utter individual weakness of the ordinary man were accomplished facts on which there was no going back, and he set himself the task of installing a public authority as manager of the people's affairs on their behalf. The contrast between the policies of the two brothers at once leaps to the eye. The aim of the elder was to restore every citizen to the status of owner, whereas the younger got a law passed which allotted to each citizen his ration of corn at a low price, soon to be given gratis. This measure went in the diametrically opposite direction to the policy of Tiberius Crackus. Tiberius had sought to multiply the numbers of independent proprietors. Gaius brought into Rome the last of them, lured there by free rations. The result was that, instead of the physical independence of society's members becoming generalized, the bulk of them became the dependents of the public authority. To carry out its new duties, that authority had necessarily to build up a separate administrative corps. It was, in time, to turn into the empire, which lost no time in creating permanent officials and praetorian guards. In truth, there is no republic except where power does not take the form of a concrete entity with its own members, where the citizens may almost without distinction be called on to manage temporarily common interests commonly conceived, and where none has a motive to increase the burdens which all support. On the other hand, power comes into being, a state in the modern sense, as soon as the gulf between individual interests has become so deep that the weakness of the mass requires the permanent protection of an all-powerful care, which cannot but behave as master. 10. The problem is still with us. Shall I be reproached for having buried my head too deeply in ancient history? But I have buried it in very recent history, too. I find a remarkable counterpart to the story of the two Gracchi and that of the two Roosevelts. Theodore Roosevelt, considering that the physical independence of the majority of citizens was the essential condition of their attachment to libertarian institutions, applied himself to fighting a plutocracy which was transforming citizens into salaried dependents. He came to grief on the same blind egoism of the men of great place as caused the downfall of Tiberius Gracchus. Franklin Roosevelt accepted the accomplished fact, took up the defense of the unemployed and the economically weak, and constructed, by means of their votes and to their immediate advantage, such a structure of power as recalled in striking fashion the work of the first Roman emperors. The individual right, the shield of each, which had become the bulwark of a few, had to bow down before the social right. And the free citizen passed a milestone on his way to becoming a protected subject. The phenomenon, when once its essence has been grasped, throws a flood of light on the political history of Europe. We may pass over the evolution of the Italian republics, which, in their progress from the patriciate to the tyranny, exactly reproduce the course of events at Rome, for it is not by these, but rather by the monarchies, that the modern states have been created, receiving from them indelible characters. An important class of freemen can be dimly discerned in the darkness of the Merovingians. But troubled times cast them into a de facto dependence, to become de jure, on a powerful squirearchy. The kingdoms of the early Middle Ages may be conceived of as a species of vast and loosely knit republics in which citizenship was the perquisite of only a few notables. But, as we have seen, the chances of preserving libertarian institutions are bound up with the proportion of the politically effective members of the society in question who desire benefit from them. We ought not, therefore, to feel surprise at the wide measure of support accorded to kings in their attempts to substitute their own authority for liberties which benefited only the few and were an oppression to the many. Those historians who are impelled by an inner need to take sides are much embarrassed by this struggle between monarchy and aristocracy. How should they pay tribute to the authoritarian labors of kings, which rescued men from feudal servitude? Albert de Broglie has described this tendency. We have had already, and even from the highest quarters, theories of French history which were very consistent, very well pieced together, and in which the whole construction stood its ground to perfection. According to these system builders, the two principles which have always taken charge of the development of France are also the fulfillment of all its prayers, equality and authority. The greatest measure of equality possible protected by the largest amount of authority imaginable, there is the ideal government for France. That is what the Crown and the Third Estate were seeking in common all through our long convulsions. To suppress both the superior ranks which dominated the bourgeoisie, and at the same time the intermediate authorities which inconvenienced the throne, to reach by that road complete equality and unlimited power, that is the final and providential tendency of French history. A royal democracy, as it has been called, in other words a master but no superiors, equal subjects but no citizens, no privileges but no rights, such is the constitution which suits us. Will historians, in their passion for libertarian and anti-absolutist institutions, admire the resistance of aristocracy to the formation of absolutism? Sismondi, for instance, states that in the Middle Ages all the real advances made in independence of character, in the safeguarding of rights, and in the limitations forced by discussion on the caprices and vices of absolute power, were due to the hereditary aristocracy. Only the English political scene does not impale the historian on this dilemma, and that by reason of certain historical peculiarities which have been well set forth by Delhomme. There, in effect, the authority of the Crown was from the first sufficiently great and security sufficiently assured to save the large class of freemen from shriveling into a narrow caste. Instead of the ambitions which had been thwarted and the activities which had been exploited by the oppressive measure of liberty enjoyed by the notables finding, as in France, a rallying point beneath the royal banner, the political strength of what may already be termed the English middle class was mustered in the wake of the squires, regarded as large-scale freemen, under the banner of liberty. The phenomenon is one of decisive importance, for it has had the effect of forming, for and throughout whole centuries, an English political outlook very different from that prevailing on the continent of Europe. 11. Of the historical formation of national characteristics. J.S. Mill, in a famous passage, threw into contrast the different political tempers of the peoples of France and England. There are two states of the inclinations, intrinsically very different, but which have something in common, by virtue of which they often combine in the direction they give to the efforts of individuals and nations. One is the desire to exercise power over others, the other is disinclination to have power exercised over themselves. The difference between different portions of mankind in the relative strength of these two dispositions is one of the most important elements in their history. Barely troubling himself to camouflage the cap, Mill then fits it on the French, who sacrifice their liberty, he explains, to the most exiguous and illusory participation in power. There are nations in whom the passion for governing others is so much stronger than the desire of personal independence, that for the mere shadow of the one they are found ready to sacrifice the whole of the other. Each one of their number is willing, like the private soldier in an army, to abdicate his personal freedom of action into the hands of his general, provided the army is triumphant and victorious, and he is able to flatter himself that he is one of a conquering host, though the notion that he has himself any share in the domination exercised over the conquered is an illusion. A government strictly limited in its powers and attributions, required to hold its hands from overmeddling, and to let most things go on without its assuming the part of guardian or director, is not to the taste of such a people. In their eyes the possessors of authority can hardly take too much upon themselves, provided the authority itself is open to general competition. An average individual among them prefers the chance, however distant or improbable, of wielding some share of power over his fellow citizens, above the certainty, to himself and others, of having no unnecessary power exercised over them. These are the elements of a people of place hunters, in whom the course of politics is mainly determined by place hunting, where equality alone is cared for, but not liberty, where the contests of political parties are but struggles to decide whether the power of meddling in everything shall belong to one class or another, perhaps merely to one kind of public men or another, where the idea entertained of democracy is merely that of opening offices to the competition of all instead of a few, where, the more popular the institutions, the more innumerable are the places created, and the more monstrous the over-government exercised by all over each, and by the executive over all. The English people, on the other hand, according to Mill, are very jealous of any attempt to exercise power over them, not sanctioned by long usage and by their own opinion of right, but they in general care very little for the exercise of power over others. The English have little sympathy with the passion for government, but no people are so fond of resisting authority when it oversteps certain prescribed limits. To the extent to which these two pictures seem to us to be true, how are we to explain such a contrast? By the characteristics acquired in the course of two quite different historical evolutions. In their capacity as leaders of the middle classes, the English aristocrats, ever since Magna Carta, associated them in their own resistance to the encroachments of power. From that ensued a general attachment to safeguards for the individual and to affirmation of a law which was independent of power and, at need, opposable to it. In France, on the other hand, it was around the monarchy that the middle classes rallied in their struggle against privileges. The victories of state legislation over custom were popular victories. So it came about that the two countries entered on the democratic era with very diverse dispositions. In one of them, the system of liberty, from being a right of persons of aristocratic origin, was to be progressively extended to all. Liberty would become a generalized privilege. For this reason it is misleading to speak of the democratization of England. It would be truer to say that the rights of the aristocracy have been extended to the plebs. The British citizen is as untouchable as a medieval noble. In France, on the other hand, the system of authority, the absolutist machine constructed by the Bourbon monarchy, was to fall into the hands of the people, taken in mass. In England, democracy would take the form of the extension to all of an individual liberty which was provided with centuries-old safeguards. In France, that of the attribution to all of a sovereignty which was armed with a centuries-old omnipotence and saw in individuals nothing but subjects. 12. Why democracy extends powers, rights, and weakens the individual's safeguards. When the people appears in the political arena in the leading part, it enters on what has been for centuries the battleground of monarchy and aristocracy. The former has forged the offensive weapons of authority, the latter has strengthened the defensive positions of liberty. According as the people has, during its long minority, rested its hope in the monarchy or in the aristocracy and collaborated in the extension or in the limitation of power, according as its admiration has traditionally gone out to kings who hang barons or to barons who turn back kings, it will have formed potent habits of mind and inveterate sentiments which will lead it on to continue either the absolutist work of the monarchy or the libertarian work of the aristocracy. Thus, the English Revolution of 1689 invoked the name of Magna Carta, whereas in the French of 1789 praises of Richelieu rang loud. He was canonized as Man of the Mountain and Jacobin. But even in countries where popular authority is orientated by potent memories towards the safeguarding of individual rights, it will inevitably tack about to power's side, and its breath will come, sooner or later, to puff the sails of sovereignty. This tacking about takes place at the bidding of the same causes as we have already seen at work at Rome. So long as the people, consisting of freemen participating in the work of government, comprises none without some individual interest to defend, so that all feel an attachment to subjective rights, liberty seems to them precious and power dangerous. But so soon as this people with voting power comprises a majority of persons who have, or think they have, nothing to defend, but are offended by great material inequalities, then it starts to set no value on anything but the power which its sovereignty gives it of overthrowing a defective social structure. It delivers itself over to the messianic promises of power. Louis Napoleon, Bismarck, and Disraeli perfectly understood this, great authoritarians all of them, who realized that, by enlarging the franchise at a time when property was becoming a closer preserve, they were, by calling in the people, paving the way for the distension of power. It was the politics of Caesarism. What folly it is to remit the judgment of events to posterity when contemporaries often see so much more clearly. Those of Napoleon III saw very well that he was not acting illogically in instituting universal suffrage while at the same time favoring the concentration of wealth and the accentuation of social inequality. Only three things matter to Caesarism. First, that those who are oldest in liberty within the society should lose their moral credit and become incapable of imparting to those who enter on the heritage of this liberty a pride of personal status embarrassing to power. Tocqueville has remarked on the part played in this respect in France by the complete extirpation of the ancient nobility. The second factor necessary to Caesarism is that a new class of capitalists should arise, without moral authority and possessed of an extreme of wealth which sets them apart from their fellow citizens. Lastly, there is the third element, which is the union of political strength with social weakness in a large dependent class. Though they heap treasure on treasure and think themselves thereby more powerful, the aristocrats of the capitalistic creation, by awakening the resentment of society, disqualify themselves forever from being its leaders against the inroads of power. Whereas the infirmities of the multitude find a natural haven in the omnipotent state. In this way is removed the only obstacle that Caesarism has to fear, a movement of libertarian resistance, emanating from a people with subjective rights to defend and under the natural leadership of eminent men whom their credit qualifies and whom the insolence of wealth does not disqualify. Chapter 18. Liberty or Security. 1. The price of liberty. 2. Ruin in servitudum. 3. Of the architecture of society. 4. Power in social promotion. 5. The middle class and liberty. 6. One level of liberty or several levels. 7. A securitarian aristocracy. 8. Disappearance of the libertarian element. 9. The pactum subjectionis. 10. Social security and state omnipotence. 11. The social protectorate, its justification and purpose. 12. Theocracies and wars of religion. The history of Western society was interpreted in the 19th century as an uninterrupted progress of the peoples towards liberty. Two periods were discerned. In the first, men, who had till then been closely bound in chains of dependence on and exploitation by particular masters, were seen being progressively extricated by means of the struggle in progress between these masters and political authority. In the second, being now more or less freed from their masters, they were in the enjoyment of a measure of civil liberty, but under the rule of a state which lived far above the heads of every social authority. All that still remained to do was to transform this supreme master of society into its servant. That was the task of democracy which, once realized, brought in its train political liberty. By this was meant the giving of obedience not, as previously, to masters, but to stewards whom the ruled had, for the furtherance of the common good, themselves appointed. This process of liberation in the material sphere was accompanied by a similar process in the spiritual. Instead of being subjected, as in the past, to the categorical imperatives of creed and conduct, men rid themselves of these superstitions and took to sitting in their own judgment seat as to what they should believe and in what manner they should act. Such were the convictions of the 19th century, which were, it is true, slow to penetrate certain spirits. But today it is a very different evolutionary process which the contemporary observer finds to record. Power, which had been refashioned for the service of society, is in reality its master. It is the less contested for claiming itself to be society's offspring. It is the more irresistible for meeting with no authority outside itself with the strength to limit it. The dethronement of the old faith, to which the state itself was subject, left an aching void in the room of beliefs and principles, a void which enabled power to enunciate and impose its own. The appeal to the state against the exploiters of human labor ended in the substitution of it for them. The result is our present tendency towards the concentration in the same hand of a unified political command and a unified economic command, towards, in other words, an absolute imperium such as was never imagined by our forefathers, to find the like of which we must turn to other civilizations, such as the ancient Egyptian. At the summit of our society are regions who, that action may be harmonized, have an eye to the harmonization of thought. At the base is a mob which is, taken all in all, obedient, credulous, and laborious, which dutifully receives from the sovereign its orders, its faith, and its daily bread, and which lives more or less in a state of servitude to a master who is immeasurably distant and impersonal. The proposition that this state of public servitude is the inevitable culminating point of the historical sequence formed by the successive stages of a civilization, can be supported with many more proofs than are available to demonstrate the interpretation of a progress towards liberty. But it would be exceeding our knowledge to assume that the sequence has a culminating point. As to that we know nothing, and we are acquainted with too few civilizations in the successive stages of their development to justify us in making their histories the norm of our own. We do no more than record that every society which has evolved in the direction of a state of individual liberty turns aside from that liberty suddenly and abruptly just when it seems on the point of attaining it. And what interests us are the reasons for this phenomenon. 1. The price of liberty. It is a mysterious excellence of language that it expresses more truths than are clearly conceived of by the speaker. We say, for instance, liberty is the most precious of all goods, without noticing everything that this formula implies in the way of social assumptions. A good tiling which is of great price is not one of the primary necessities. Water costs nothing at all, and bread very little. What costs much is something like a Rembrandt, which, though its price is above rubies, is wanted by very few people, and by none who have not, as it happens, a sufficiency of bread and water. Precious things, therefore, are really desired by but few human beings and not even by them until their primary needs have been amply provided. It is from this point of view that liberty needs to be looked at. A fable will, perhaps, render her more intelligible to us. A man is wandering in the jungle, relying for his food on the uncertainties of the chase, in constant danger from wild beasts of all kinds. A caravan comes by him, he runs to it and is glad to find rest in the security of numbers and an abundance of provisions. He becomes the most docile of all the chief's servants, and arrives under his aegis at the city. At first he enjoys the wonders of the city, but, getting quickly acclimatized to his security, it comes over him that he is now a slave, and he seeks his freedom. In the end he becomes free. But just at that moment the city is overwhelmed by nomad tribes who pillage, burn, and massacre. Our man flees into the countryside and takes refuge in a fortress in which a baron shelters beasts and men. He pledges to this protector all his productive energies, the consideration being the life which has been saved to him. But a strong power brings back order to life, and our man is soon heard complaining of the baronial fatigues. These he transforms into a tribute of money which he contrives to make progressively smaller until in the end he sets up as an independent proprietor. Or again he sets off for the town, where he seeks to hire out the labor of his hands as it pleases him, or to find an opening in some industry which fits his capacity. Then there is a sudden economic crisis. The farmer and the industrialist can no longer sell at the anticipated price. The worker is thrown onto the street. Once more our man looks for some master with whom he is safe for a regular pittance, either by having a stated quantity of what he produces taken at an assured price or by having guaranteed him stable employment and a stable wage. In this way we see how, in the case of the hero of our allegory, the will to be free is in time of danger extinguished and revives again when once the need of security has received satisfaction. Liberty is in fact only a secondary need, the primary need is security. The idea of security merits, therefore, some examination. Examination at once reveals its complex nature. For which reason its opposite, insecurity, is more manageable. This we will define as the carking anxiety of being threatened with a disastrous occurrence. Insecurity, as is at once apparent, is a function of three variables. To start with, what is a disastrous occurrence? For one man a mere loss of money answers the description, whereas another will not so regard death itself. It follows that, as greatness of soul is more or less present, the number of disastrous occurrences is more or less extensive. Take the case of an individual for whom any one of a given number of occurrences is disastrous. The chances of one or another of these occurrences happening are greater or smaller according to the age in which he lives and his own condition. The chances of violent death are different in the 19th century from what they were in the time of the barbarian invasions. But men do not submit these risks to the process of mathematical calculation. A sanguine man underestimates them, a nervous man exaggerates them. The feeling of insecurity may, then, be represented as a function which carries different intensities for each member of any given community at any given time, according to the number of things feared by each, the mathematical probability of one or another of them happening, and the propensity of each to exaggerate or underestimate this probability. The greater this feeling of insecurity and the stronger the individual man's desire for protection, the higher also is the price which he will pay for this protection. The feeling of security is, as we said above, the opposite of this feeling which is, in principle, of measurable intensity. In that case security too is of measurable intensity, and the more strongly it is felt the stronger also will be the will to liberty. 2. Ruin in servitudem. The conclusion is that there never was a time in any society whatsoever when some individuals did not feel themselves to be insufficiently protected, and others did not feel themselves to be insufficiently free. The former I will call securitarians and the latter libertarians. This line of reasoning, as is at once apparent, forces on us a correction of our earlier hypotheses concerning the relations between powers and the social authorities. The social key positions may in time lapse into the hands of securitarians, who will not rest until they have exchanged the independence which might have been theirs for a guarantee from the state. We shall consider the consequences of this phenomenon later. It is also apparent that, taking one country with another and assuming that the risks are equal, the spirit of liberty will be more prevalent where the spirit of men is prouder, or even where their temperaments are merely cast in a more sanguine mold. If, then, character is debased by an effeminate education, or if life takes new forms which generate anxiety without the real risks being increased, the proportion of securitarians will go up, If, again, the real likelihood of terrible occurrences is suddenly intensified, almost the whole of a society may go securitarian. It is for this reason that the freemen of the 8th to the 10th centuries rated their liberty cheaply. Seeking a strong right arm to protect them against the fury of the Saracen or the Norman or the Magyar, they made haste to raise up with their own hands the citadel which was to be for centuries their descendants' prison. Bold and few were to be those who would, later, venture themselves outside their lord's domain, those whose adventurous peddling was to found the fortunes and the dynasties of the merchant patriciate. It was to require the increasing warmth of the king's peace to melt off from the iceberg of feudal servitude its most capable and energetic elements. These became the bourgeoisie of the towns while the rest lingered on in feudal bonds. The history of the intelligentsia shows how surely infeudation follows in the wake of insecurity. The murder of Archimedes at the siege of Syracuse symbolizes the intellectual's fate in ages of violence. Let an ancient society be invaded by barbarians or let passion arouse in it the barbarism that slumbers there, and the first victims are sure to be the intellectuals. What is the intellectual to do next? At the time of the downfall of the Roman Empire he took precipitate refuge in the church. That for him was the safe life, and it was also, thanks to the munificence of the new masters, to be a life of rapidly growing opulence. For more than 500 years every intellectual was in religious orders. Not, we may be sure, that every intellectual was a believer, but because an intellectual and social discipline was the price paid for security. As physical security came to seem better assured, some few ventured to step outside this tutelary watch and ward. But the great majority of the intellectuals remained within the family of the church, from which they drew a pittance, small but certain. For instance, even as late as the 18th century, men like Condillac and Sieyès were abbés. 3. Of the architecture of society. He who has grasped the conception of the libertarian and securitarian sentiments being measurable quantities of opposites can envisage any society whatsoever, at any given moment of its existence, as a multitude of specks, each corresponding to an individual, which can be arranged in tiers by reference to their libertarian content. The most securitarian among them will, as I see it, be quite at the bottom and the most libertarian right at the top, and the rest will be spread out according to the ratio between their aspirations to liberty and their need for security. We may conceive this image as bearing the general appearance of a pyramid or a spindle. Whichever we take, there will in either case be an arrangement of horizontal tiers, acting as lines of demarcation, in each of which is found a particular group of individuals, categorized by reference to temperament. These categories we may call alpha, beta, gamma, and so on, starting from the top. But still using the simile of specks to represent the members of society, we can also distribute these specks by reference to another principle, namely their position in society. Social position is something which does not admit of logical definition, but which we know by feeling it. Leaving aside for the moment, as being unnecessary to our purpose, any attempt to give precision to the idea of social position, we will, trusting to impression alone, present yet another image, that of the arrangement of society in tiers by reference to stations in life. Here too are lines of demarcation, separating off what are commonly called classes. Let us call them A, B, C, and so on. If we now bring these two images together, what is the conclusion which their confrontation suggests to us? Will there be a correlation of classes and categories, so that A corresponds to alpha, B to beta, and so on? There certainly will not be an absolute correlation. All the A's will not, through pride of rank, be seen disdaining every form of protection. Nor will all the Z's find their impotence so alarming as to have no other concern but that of getting themselves assistance. In each class and for each society there will be a certain degree of correlation. One thing is certain, that the correlation will be at its maximum either in a society which is in process of formation or in one which has just undergone a complete overthrow. It is in such times as those that audacity takes wing. By accepting all risks and seizing all initiatives, the bold become the rulers. Whereas, on the contrary, the timid run to cover and support, so that the degree of their subjection will give the almost exact measure of their fears. There are in a society of this kind great inequalities, but there is in it, notwithstanding, a social equilibrium for the reason that liberties enjoyed are in proportion to risks taken. This equilibrium, however, is soon, inevitably, disturbed. The nature of men is such that they organize into subjective rights the positions which they have won for themselves, they monopolize them and pass them on to their descendants. No doubt it is true that the force of example, education, and perhaps heredity, of which we have still so much to learn, tend to preserve in each class the characteristics proper to each. But the process is an incomplete one. Men of libertarian temperament make their appearance in the depths, and the men on the top show more and more marked securitarian trends. The result is that the arrangement in tiers by reference to stations in life ceases to correspond with that by reference to temperament. The degree of correlation is lowered and the social equilibrium is destroyed. If society was so fluid a thing that some went up and others down without impediment, the equilibrium could be maintained. But in fact, as has been said above, a powerful instinct for acquisition and conservation is at work, which tends to stabilize the status quo and render the barriers impassable. The various turns which events may take are all easily imagined. Sometimes it happens that, as at Sparta, the upper classes long succeed in continuing to produce virile types of men, by means of a severe training and a rigorous exclusiveness. Sometimes it happens that, without disturbance to the existing arrangements of tiers, they throw open their ranks to fresh infusions of energy. That happened at a certain period of Roman history, and at a certain period of English history, but the most striking instance of it is seen in the Middle Ages, up to about the time of St. Louis. Then the baron who led to the wars the most valiant of his men at arms would often knight the serf who had displayed outstanding courage, and the origin of the true feudal nobility was no other than that. At a later date, with the development of economic activities, wealth became the road to nobility. Let a man buy a noble fief and himself fulfill its military obligations, and he had only to show that he had lived a noble's life for 3 generations to place beyond dispute his status as noble. Power may also be the upward path to social distinction. But of all the means of replenishing the upper strata, this is the least adapted to reviving their libertarian virtues. 4. Power in social promotion. In the image in which we represented the architecture of society, the body of officialdom found no place. There was reason for this. For in a nascent society, or in one which is making an entirely fresh start, there is not and cannot be a political authority as distinct from the social authority. In them political authority can be the product only of the willing assent of men who have risen spontaneously to positions of command. A power which looked elsewhere for support would be nerveless, and it receives their support only at the price of gaining their assent to its decisions. But this coalescence of political power with the social authorities does not endure forever. The reasons for its disappearance are various, but chief among them is the coming of a head chief whose policy it is to reduce his peers to a subordinate position, in other words, a king. As we have seen, his next step is to court an alliance with the inferior classes, but what is emphasized here is that it is to the more vigorous elements of those classes that he goes for support, to those whose station in life is out of relation to their energies. The more difficult the process of transition from one class to another is made, the greater is the commotion among these elements to find an outlet. The king provides them with the outlet which they need by enrolling them in his service, and the body of the state draws fresh life from their young strength. This is the first phenomenon to mark the encroachment of political power on the aristocratic authorities. A second, already described by us, accompanies it. With a view to breaking down the resistance of the aristocracy, power strives to loosen the hold of the notables on their dependents. This results in a change of status for the dependents. To be at the mercy of a single master is a wretched condition. But when there are 2 masters, squire and state, battling for their allegiance, the intervention of power creates for them a sort of liberty. Not, it is true, the liberty which comes from a man's own assertion of his own rights, but a poorer quality of liberty, liberty by another's intervention, than which the securitarian temper can know no other. The third phenomenon to mark is the progressive invasion of the high social strata by elements from below. They ascend by the official ladder and then, grown rich in the service, break away from it. It is far from being the case that these new aristocrats show all the characteristics of the old, or even of those who have climbed the rungs of society's ladder by their own unaided efforts. It is one thing to rise at the riser's own risks, another to owe promotion to a master's favor. A pirate like Drake, enriched by his voyages, the importance of which his ennoblement, if nothing else, attests, owes everything to himself and makes a very different sort of aristocrat from a public administrator grown great in public offices often by qualities of flexibility rather than of energy. No absolute rule can be laid down, and there have been public functionaries who have displayed the most virile qualities. But often also, as was seen in the late Roman Empire, the functionary is only a freedman who has never shaken off the characteristics of a slave. Recruited from these freedmen, the ruling class of the late empire became tame and spiritless. Towards the end of the Ancien regime, the French aristocracy, too, felt the effect of the ways in which most of its members had obtained their elevation, as may be seen in the astonishing picture of Pontchartrain given us by Saint-Simon. 5. The middle class and liberty. The tone of an aristocracy gets transformed by the process of internal decay, along with its restocking by elements with little in them of the libertarian spirit. Securitarian elements come to predominate in it. It is the most pitiable spectacle to be found in social history. Instead of maintaining their position by their own energy and prestige, as men who are always ready to take the initiatives, responsibilities, and risks which are too formidable for the other members of society, the privileged, whose role it is to protect others, aim at being protected. Who alone is placed high enough to protect them? The state. They ask it to defend for them the positions which they are no longer capable of defending for themselves and are therefore unfit to occupy. When the French nobility, recruited as it then was by the purchase of public offices, was no longer capable of excellence in war, then was the time that it got reserved to it by law the officers' berths. When to the merchants who, like Sinbad, embarked in a voyage their entire capital there had succeeded a prudent generation of traders, the latter sought to have the king's navy secure to their travelers exclusive rights to some distant coast, from which their ancestors would have kept all intruders away themselves by their own artillery. How can men whose authority rests on power's guarantee oppose to it the proud independence which honorably distinguished the ancient aristocracy? Lacking now all strength of their own, they no longer uphold power, no longer upholding power, they have become incapable of limiting it. The notions of aristocracy and liberty have parted company. The heirs of their libertarian aspirations are the middle class. We will define the middle class, if we must, as composed of those who have enough social strength to stand in no need of any special protection and to desire the largest measure of liberty, but have on the other hand not enough strength to make their liberties oppressive to others. A class of this kind can only develop when general security has reached a certain level. For in a time of general insecurity the elements of society must combine into sufficiently large aggregates for safety, and the result is squirearchy. It is only at a later date, when the public power is sufficiently in the saddle, that less force is needed to maintain an independent existence. When that has happened the hour of the middle class has sounded. It then becomes, as Aristotle stressed, the most important element in the body of society. If it is a case of disciplining an aristocracy which is making disorderly use of its strength, it is the natural ally of power. Whenever the state tries to stifle liberty, it is the natural ally of the aristocracy. Its specific interests make it the champion of a republic in which the order necessary for the maintenance of security is made compatible with the tolerance necessary for the practice of liberty. It is, as a class, so attuned to a regime of moderation that, wherever it flourishes, such a regime comes into being, and, whenever it disappears, such a regime sinks without trace. It is a well-known historical fact that when at Rome this class of the population had been decimated and proletarianized by a succession of wars, the republic broke down. It is a no less safe generalization that its shipwreck is the proximate cause of modern despotisms. Tyrannies made their appearance in step with the inflation which destroyed the independence and security of middle-class liberalism. 6. One level of liberty or several levels. We can take things a step further. The position of this class is, as we have said, sufficiently secure for it to have no other wish than liberty. Suppose that power has come into its hands. It then has a choice of one of two courses. Either it retains this liberty for itself without generalizing it, while contriving for the lower strata all the security which they need, and permitting and even facilitating migration from the securitarian zone to the libertarian. Or else it extends this liberty to everyone. In the 18th and 19th centuries it followed, as we have seen, the second of these two policies. But there was a fatal corollary. By sharing with all the degree of liberty which was suited to itself, it withdrew from the classes below it the means of protection which it did not need itself. In this the logical connection is clear enough, but misconception on the subject seems to be so widespread that we must pause a moment to clear it up. An example will assist. One of the most important aspects of liberty is liberty to contract. It is consistent with the dignity of a freeman that he should be able to engage and bind himself by his own voluntary act. That was the view of the Romans, who used the same word, leges, to denote laws which were binding on everyone and contracts which were binding on parties. The same idea turns up again in the French Civil Code. Contract is the law of the parties. It has been a fixed tenet of jurists, arguing irrefutably from these premises, that the worker was bound by his contract of service, and that a strike was a unilateral breach of this contract, which gave the employer the right to sue for damages. In our own time even the illustrious Duguid has refurbished in peremptory style this line of reasoning. But the consequences of this logic proved unacceptable, as working out too hardly for the employee, just as it also worked out too hardly to place on him the economic burden of every injury caused him at his work which did not result from the fault of his employer, and yet that is the way in which things should have gone, since what was in question were the relations between two freemen, each of whom should take the consequences of his own clumsiness or mischance. A whole code of social legislation has stepped in to protect the worker and confer on him privileges. Nor were the superior classes, who had to support the burden of it, in good case to be heard and protest against it. For in this way there was established, bit by bit, the securitarian body of law, which will always be necessary for most men. But at the same time, the obverse side of this securitarian policy seems to have been imperfectly discerned. In effect, it imports a discrimination between men, all of whom enjoy the nominal status of free, and denies to the multitude the risks, the responsibilities, and, as a natural consequence, the preferments of liberty. 7. A securitarian aristocracy. This retreat from the obligations of liberty was the less remarked because at the other end of the social ladder the same phenomenon was happening, though here it was without the excuse of necessity. If it is the function of an aristocracy which disposes of large resources and enjoys a large measure of liberty to prevent abuses and disorder by means of a strict self-discipline, then no aristocracy ever failed in its duty more completely than that which was raised in the soil of the employing class. If an aristocracy is false to its duty when it takes to shuffling out of responsibilities and risks, and making its sole aim the security of its possessions and position, then no other aristocracy ever made greater haste to leave its post than the capitalist. How has it in fact functioned? Whereas in the early decades of the 19th century there were to be found a large number of proprietors, each of whom bore the risks involved in his particular undertaking, by the end of the century there was a much smaller class which, with the aid of the limited liability company and the money market, controlled gigantic enterprises and regulated all economic activities. An aristocracy indeed. But without the honor that belongs to aristocracy and directs its actions in well-ordered channels, one which was careful to divorce from the command, which it exercised, the responsibility, which it rejected, and the risks, which it palmed off onto the shareholders. It can scarcely be denied that this small capitalist aristocracy has dealt more generously with its employees than did the large proprietary class which preceded it. For all that, it is not surprising that it has aroused more anger and hatred. For men put up with any masters who show themselves brave and self-disciplined. The Roman legionaries did not grumble when the consul, who had given them throughout one example of endurance after the other, took the lion's share of the spoils for himself. But when intrigues at home enabled clever men to appropriate the greater part of the Ager Romanus, that was taken badly. Similarly, the bourgeois who was seen by all to be devoting all his time and his entire fortune to a business which bore his name and to which his honor was pledged, won men's respect. But under the reign of anonymity the case was different. Every method of shaking off risks came alike to the new aristocracy. And more, following the usual securitarian procedure, it came to monopolize the positions which it had won and to shore them up with the authority of the state. The breaking of the storm is the signal for big business to panic. In the name of the general interest it supplicates power to support and save it. 8. Disappearance of the libertarian element. At the time of the 20-year crisis between the two wars, the proletarians were in a fair way to assure themselves of a miserable sort of security, the outward expression of which was unemployment benefit. The aristocrats had found in the backing of the state another and more gilded kind. Between them lay a middle class, which had been already, according to the country to which it belonged, half or wholly proletarianized by inflation. It too had been struck by the great wave of insecurity. The upheaval was on a scale that gave the lie to the wisdom of 1,000 years. It had been held in assured truth that a man of character and capacity never lacked work. And yet highly qualified engineers, like the lowest grades of unskilled labor, were given to understand that their services were not wanted. The disgrace of unemployment quickly gave birth to the idea that to obtain work was a matter of luck or nepotism. Another adage which generations had consecrated was that to produce more was to improve the producer's standard of life. The vine grower, the fisherman, and many others besides were now to be taught the lesson that increases in production may reduce profit and reductions in production may increase it. Lastly, it had been taken as proved that abstemiousness in the present would assure to a man a better future for himself and his family. A fresh wave of devaluations now completed the lesson of the war and made a mockery of individual forethought, contrary to all right and reason. The debtor waxed fat on the loans granted him, loans which impoverished the creditor. A whole science of living, which, simple though it was, had till then sufficed, went by the board. It was as though a crowd of fishermen, each in control of his own boat, had had all their plans upset by the sudden unaccountable behavior of the tides, the wind, and the fish. What was to happen next? This is what happened. Note was taken of the existence of certain sheltered occupations. The official was seen to be in a comfortable niche and to be safe for his pension. The great public utility undertakings, in their monopolistic positions, were seen to be maintaining and even improving on their normal profits. It was, then, to these sheltered sectors that the crowd inevitably gravitated in its bewilderment. And as there was not room in them for everybody, the natural desire of all men was to include their own sectors of activity among the sheltered. 9. The Pactum Subjectionis. The essential psychological characteristic of our age is the predominance of fear over self-confidence. The worker is afraid of unemployment and of having nothing saved for old age. His demand is for what is nowadays called social security. But the banker is just as timorous, fearing for his investments. He places the capital monies at his disposal in government issues, and is content to credit effortlessly the difference between the interest earned by these securities and the interest which he pays out to his depositors. Everyone of every class tries to rest his individual existence on the bosom of the state and tends to regard the state as the universal provider. And President Franklin Roosevelt came out as the perfect psychologist when he laid down as the new rights of men the right of the worker to be regularly employed at a regular salary, the right of the producer to sell stable quantities of goods at a stable price, and so on. Such are, in substance, the securitarian aspirations of our time. The new rights of man are given out as coming to complete those already proclaimed in the 18th century. But the least reflection is sufficient to show that in fact they contradict and abrogate them. The old ones, in decreeing liberty, made each man the sole master of his own actions. The state could not guarantee their consequences, which had to be borne by the individual alone. Whereas, on the other hand, if the state is to guarantee to a man what the consequences of his actions shall be, it must take control of his activities. In the first case, a man is thought of as an adult, he is freed from tutelage and left to face the risks of life himself. Whereas, in the second, the purpose is to keep him out of the way of risks, he is treated as an incapable and put in leading strings. The conclusion is, then, that the promises of today in fact close the cycle which was opened by the declarations of earlier days. The liberty then given is taken back in exchange for a security which is desired by all. The mind of man needs, like his heart, objects of affection, they land him in the same evasions. All that he wants to see in any given phenomenon are those aspects of it which flatter and exalt him, not those which offend and mortify him. He dissociates what life has made inseparables, praises the cause and condemns the consequence, applauds the end and repudiates the means, affirms an idea and denies its corollary. Thus the rights of man fill us with exultation, but the bourgeois ferocity of society in the days of Louis Philippe, its indifference to the unemployed man and its cruelty to the bankrupt offend our sensibilities. So we refuse to see in all this merely two closely linked aspects of the same spirit. The spirit was that of a class which, seeking a full outlet to its energies, sought to throw down all barriers to its activity, like the giant seen on the frontispiece of a well-known pamphlet with this epigraph, "Take his chains off him and let him go." Its aim was the removal of all obstacles from the social arena, without pausing to consider that these had been necessary as handrails and useful as supports. It decreed that a man should be the sole ruler of his conduct and the sole author of his fate. But, once this course had been set, the rule of life could only be that which Carlyle formulated in anger: every man for himself and let the devil take the hindmost. The plenitude of liberty carried with it the plenitude of risks. There could henceforward be as little succor for the weak as there could be restriction on the strong. It was the survival of the fittest, an idea which, as is known, was not suggested to Darwin by the spectacle of nature, but was, on the contrary, taken by him from the philosophers of individualism. The full harshness of a regime of this kind was bound to fall on those who were bad starters, namely the proletariat. A society in which there was the same degree of liberty and the same absence of protection for every one of its members created for those who were worse placed an insecurity which was insupportable. These were the first to protest against a right to liberty which was common to all and to demand protective measures. But even those who were deemed strong, they too took fright in their turn. The whole of society without exception reached the point of demanding security. Security has to be paid for. It is for that reason that we are today the participants in what the old writers called a pactum subjectionis, by which men surrender to the state their individual rights in consideration for the social rights received back from it. 10. Social security and state omnipotence. What concrete proof is there, we may be asked, that those who seek social security find an authoritarian state? The facts are clear to see. In two countries with opposite political traditions, two men, than whom two more different cannot be imagined, were simultaneously carried to power by the same securitarian aspiration of a people maddened by the post-war crisis. We must keep in mind the complete contrast between the two nations and the two rulers, but it is even so most noticeable that the role of savior assumed by power justified both in the United States and in Germany a prodigious step forward by the state, the symptoms of which were the same multiplication of officials, the same triumph of the central authority over the regional authorities, the same subordination of business to politics. It is true that the process went further in Germany than in America. But then they started from very different positions. In the case of Germany, a federal state was converted into a unitary state, but the unitary principle was already implicit in the Prussian predominance in the Reich. Whereas only the tiny District of Columbia was governed directly from Washington. The strength and vitality of the states' governments were so great that the subordination of those governments in the space of a few years verges on the miraculous. America was a country which was a stranger to compulsory military service, in which the tradition was to elect officials to office, and in which power was subject to judicial control. Is it not astounding that power was able in a few years to reduce this control nearly to the vanishing point, to build up a vast bureaucracy, and to invest this bureaucracy with such wide powers that a number of federal agencies have been established simultaneously to formulate rules, to apply them, and to punish breaches of them, to act, in other words, as legislator, executive, and judge? Finally, nothing has strengthened power's grip so much as its continuance, however unconstitutional, in the same hands. Thus, two states, as dissimilar as they well could be, both swept forward simultaneously towards omnipotence, borne on the wave of the same securitarian aspirations. We have already seen how greatly aspirations of that kind serve to distend the state. Let us now examine how they do it. The state is expected to be a shelter from the blast. The result is seen in an eagerness to accept its growth on the part of all the candidates for security. It comes to be looked on as a sort of living umbrella, and its proliferation is received not only with complacency but with enthusiasm. For instance, the criticisms with which every increase in the bureaucratic machine would have been received in other times are quickly stifled when it is a case of putting into force schemes of social insurance. The state, when once it is made the giver of protection and security, has but to urge the necessities of its protectorate and overlordship to justify its encroachments. Bismarck realized long ago that this was the road which led to enlarged authority. The sense of insecurity, which, in growing more generalizes also the eagerness to undergo authority, acts on power as a stimulus and excitation. Power draws its energy from the social atoms which furnish it forth. In a time of security, men of energy and enterprise tend to be in society the means of raising themselves, and not to enter the service of the state machine. But a time of social confusion deflects them towards power. Anyone analyzing the new entries into new regimes, whether at Washington or Berlin, would find them composed of elements which would not, for the most part, have been attracted to government in normal times. In a time of insecurity such as ours, we find, then, these two factors which seat a social protectorate in power, in society a marked predisposition to be governed, and in government a personnel of unusual drive. 11. The social protectorate, its justification and purpose. Every people is today being swept along on the same current, though not all at the same rate, towards the social protectorate. The interests which uncertainty has frightened, the reason which disorder has offended, the feelings which misery has revolted, the imagination which the vision of future possibilities has inflamed, all these call with one voice for a manager and lawgiver. The pressure of needs, desires, passions, and dreams helps him, once found, to overthrow every constitutional obstacle, legal or moral, that stands in his path, obstacles which were already in dissolution, thanks to the decay of absolute values, the hatred felt for acquired rights, and the fierce and vengeful spirit of parties. To do all, power must be lord of all. The peoples reckon that it will continue to be the docile recipient of their impulsions while at the same time it secures for them concrete results which can only be obtained by the continuous pursuit of systematic policies. The experts expect it to plan all social mechanisms by reference to objective reason, when it is nothing better than a bubbling cauldron of subjective wills. Everything beckons on the agents of power to vaster ambitions. The noblest of these ambitions are not on that account the least dangerous. Their aim is to be the architects of public happiness and historical progress. From the time that religion lost its empire over the spirit of man, the avowed end of human existence has been happiness. The American Declaration of Independence included in the catalogue of the rights of men the pursuit of happiness. In the view of the Founding Fathers, it was the business of each man to secure his own happiness. But could not the vast resources of the state help in securing it for him? Should they not be used for this purpose? As long ago as 1891, Joseph Chamberlain expressed the view that the state was entitled to pass any law or perform any action which might increase the sum of human happiness. The scientists having reduced the human being to one animal among many, another notion came to birth, that of the perfectibility of the species. Was it not power's business to impel the human animal along the path of his perfection? Human behavior was made the object of studies which stressed its irrationality. The 18th century had trusted to instinct to guide man in accordance with his best interests once he had been freed from restraints and superstitions. Instinct is today regarded, not as an infallible natural guide, but as a collective memory which is rich in nothing but slowly realized accretions. So imperfect a guide does it make that there are savage peoples who have been known to let themselves starve to death in the near vicinity of herbs and roots which they had never been taught to regard as edible. Examined in the light of science, human behavior looks to be susceptible of many improvements which would increase individual happiness and advance the progress of the species. It is far from being the case, to take some of the commonest examples, that the family dietary is well balanced and intelligent care taken of the body. How infinitely fair and healthy men could be, would they but cease to be the slaves of habit and the playthings of chance. And what a welter of a world is this in which children who were conceived in inadvertence grow like wild grasses, in which towns spread as greedy speculators direct, like blind animals sprawling in their own excrement. I pity the man who has never experienced the noble temptation to play the gardener to this disorder, to build cities of the sun, which shall be peopled by a nobler race. But there is in these visions a danger. Men whose stock of knowledge is small find them intoxicating and may be readily convinced by them that the happiness of a continent requires the complete suppression of fermented liquors, or, worse still, the extermination of an entire race whose blood is deemed impure. Only a man who has himself gone in search of truth knows how deceptive is the blaze of evidence with which a proposition may suddenly dazzle his eyes. The light soon fails, and then the hunt is on again. The entire field of knowledge would have to be covered to measure how few discoveries are sufficiently well grounded to justify a man in basing on them any actions which affected the whole of human society, or to appreciate as well the difficulty of reconciling the often discrepant indications furnished by independent branches of learning. In the absence of this intellectual realization of the limits of knowledge, the worldly wisdom of ancient aristocracies may often shield us from the various enthusiasms which, in their desire to be constructive, come near to being incendiary. Everywhere, however, it happens that the handling of public affairs gets entrusted to a class which stands in physical need of certitudes and takes dubious truths to its bosom with the same fanaticism as did in other times the Hussites and the Anabaptists. 12. Theocracies and wars of religion. Faith has been pitchforked out of the political scene, but to no purpose. Religious aspiration is natural to man, so much so that he even invests interests and opinions with the halos of idolatrous cults. He commits his gold rings to any errand who makes for him a god. For that reason power, on passing into the hands of a vicarious sect, takes on the character of a theocracy, a character without which it could not hope to win the degree of obedience necessary to the accomplishment of its tasks as protector of all. These tasks, in fact, make higher demands on discipline than would ever be met by the rational assent of the citizens, who have been known, even after giving their express approval to a particular measure, to obstruct its application with virtual unanimity. Therefore, there must be means of constraint. The growth of the police, in numbers, importance, and dignity, is a universal phenomenon at the present time. But this direct constraint must be used sparingly. The secret of success is to reach the mind, and propaganda is the indispensable adjunct of the police. But this propaganda, too, has its requirements, which are certain master words, thrilling in all who hear them chords that are stretched on one and the same faith. Thus, all stands firm in the structure of the new state. There are no limits to the Minotaur's beneficent protection, there can be none, therefore, to his authority. To be always sure of himself, he must be convinced, and, to be obeyed, he must convince, so he unites in his own person the spiritual and temporal powers, joining together what Western civilization had always until then kept separate. In that separation lay its unique achievement, and perhaps the secret of its tremendous success. It is astounding how little conscious we are of the pace at which we are moving towards a regime of this kind. With it as the goal, political struggles take on a new sharpness and cruelty. Men feel in their bones that there is now no longer room for what used to be called private life. Such as the Minotaur's success in molding the lives of individuals that escape from him is impossible. There is, therefore, no salvation but in seizing him. The words "I will live in a certain way" are now pointless. What must be said is, to live in a certain way myself, I must seize the controls of the great machine and employ them in such manner as suits me. It is a time of proscriptions and civil wars. It is also a time of wars between nations, for these titans are allergic to each other. And what wars they are! For what is now at the disposal of rulers is not a mere segment of the national resources, but the entire spiritual and material resources of whole communities, to which they have become the poor box, the housing authority, and the god. Chapter 19. Order or Social Protectorate. 1. The liberal negation. 2. The legalitarian criticism. 3. The modern problem and its absurd solution. 4. The miracle of confidence. 5. Concepts of right conduct. 6. On the regulation of society. 7. New functions necessitate new constraining concepts. 8. Social authorities without ethical codes. 9. Consequences of a false conception of society. 10. From chaos to totalitarianism. 11. The fruits of individualist rationalism. We are the witnesses of a fundamental transformation of society, of a crowning expansion of power. The revolutions and coups d'état which are a feature of our epoch are but insignificant episodes heralding the coming of the social protectorate. A beneficent authority will watch over every man from the cradle to the grave, repairing the disasters which befall him, even when they are of his own making, controlling his personal development and orientating him towards the most appropriate use of his faculties. By a necessary corollary, this authority will be the disposer of society's entire resources, with a view to getting from them the highest possible return and in that way multiplying the benefits which it confers. Power takes over, as it were, the whole business of public and private happiness, and it is an indispensable clause of the contract that all possessions, all productive energies, and all liberties should be handed over to it, as being the labor and the raw materials without which it cannot accomplish so gigantic a task. The business is one of setting up an immense patriarchy, or, if anyone prefers the word, a matriarchy, since we are now told that collective authority should be animated by maternal instincts. It is, no doubt, true that not every mind has a clear conception of the goal to which the pressure behind the idea of a social protectorate is driving. But it is obvious enough to the thoughtful. There are those who denounce it in panic, but with no clear perception of the force and complexity of the causes at work. There are those who welcome it, but with no care for all the ensuing consequences. In truth, the atmosphere of the whole debate is less that of two doctors calmly discussing a course of treatment than that of two swimmers swept away by a current, against which one struggles while the other deliberately abandons himself to it. It is an atmosphere not of reason but of emotion. Our analysis of the growth of power has put us in the way of understanding the great phenomenon of modern times. We will now set down the reasons for which it is opposed, recall the immediate factors which fight for it, underline its dangers, and, finally and above all, plumb the profound causes which in present conditions make it inevitable, that we may ask ourselves whether their nature partakes of absolute or of contingent necessity. 1. The liberal negation. The liberal school of thought denies flatly that it is any business of the state to undertake the tasks to which it is now bidden and on which it enters with enthusiasm, for they lie, it says, outside the normal sphere of its competence. The very terms used remind us that we are at this point entering fresh field, that we are leaving behind us the examination of power as a phenomenon, for the ethical study of the state. This change of terminology is not only permissible but obligatory, for we are now done with inquiries as to what is, and are facing up to various opinions as to what ought to be. But the new departure needed to have attention called to it, for nothing is worse than to jumble up the normative and the positive. What we are told, then, is that the state is leaving the normal sphere of its competence. Let us see what the liberal has to say on this, basing ourselves on the arguments of a man of clear intelligence, Émile Faguet. The state, you tell us, has a normal sphere of competence. Agreed, but how do you define it? To assure internal order and external security. What has determined it? The nature of society, which is formed for the defense of all against aggression from without and of each man against assault by his neighbor. But at this point I pull you up. Who compels me to subscribe to your conception of society? Were I a small peasant proprietor, living autarkically with my family, for me, no doubt, society would be merely an institution of repression, assuring me my security by means of the soldier and the policeman. But were I, on the other hand, a worker, producing what is useless to myself and receiving my requirements through the complex mechanism of the labor of a crowd of others, for me society would tend rather to wear the aspect of a workers' association. I should be led to regard it as being in essence a cooperative institution, by means of which I receive, in exchange for a given quantity of work, a given quantity of goods and services. And if this exchange is irregular or seems to me inequitable, why should I not invoke the intervention of power to regularize the cooperation, just as you yourself, my liberal proprietor, invoke it to suppress any attack on your property? Then what becomes of your normal sphere? It is now nothing but your conception of what the public authority ought to be. It is in my view a narrow, out-of-date conception, which does not respond to my needs. I oppose to it my conception, and I will bring mine out on top. But I go further, I want to accept your definition of the normal sphere. You said external security. Very well, it is apparent that neighboring states are controlling and disposing of the entire resources of their nations with a view to producing the maximum military strength. That being so, the duty of defense, which you include among the normal duties of the state, forces our power to control and dispose of everything. You also referred to internal order. But what sort of order is this, in which I cannot find employment for my stock of labor, I am not sure of procuring for my children what the young of savages receive from nature, and the slightest financial shock may render useless a lifetime of forethought? So even your own formula refutes you. It gives me no pleasure to crush in argument the liberal standpoint. Its mistake is to have taken up positions which are as untenable in discussion as they are irrelevant to the needs and passions of men. The image in which it makes power does not respond to the reality of any time or country. Power has never regarded as forbidden territory the domains of social and economic interests. When the French Civil Code prescribed the division of property on death, it was prescribing what was, both in intention and in effect, a social and economic measure. And the law of 1867 on limited companies has also had momentous consequences of the kind. The liberal negation is, therefore, in the forms in which it is clothed, quite utopian. 2. The legalitarian criticism. That is not in the least to say that no other critical standpoint is possible. To establish it, let us borrow from theology certain elementary notions. When the intelligence, unsupported by either study or revelation, applies itself to its essential objective, the knowledge of God, it forms by a natural process two antithetical conceptions. One is that of a miraculous providence, which is reached and set in motion by prayers for particular objects and then intervenes to disturb for the benefit of its invoker the natural course of things. And the other is that of a supreme wisdom, which has subjected everything to laws of a majestic regularity and then leaves them to operate unchecked. Theology has, as is known, admirably reconciled the two conceptions in the account of the divine nature which it has drawn up. It is enough for our present purpose to have borrowed from it the antithesis in its crudest form that we may apply it to the government of human affairs. This government may take one of two forms, the legalitarian or the providential. It may buttress with sanctions fixed and relatively unchangeable laws, and see to their exact execution, while treating with respect whatever consequences they have, or else it may take occasional interventions and bring to each situation as it arises its own remedy, with the result that there are no longer fixed laws but rather an uninterrupted series of miracles or arbitrary acts. Political philosophy in every age has thrown into contrast the two conceptions, which 25 centuries ago were called by the Chinese government by the laws and government by men respectively. The first, clearly, is an ideal which does not admit of more than a partial attainment. We will examine it summarily, and endeavor, in doing so, to introduce for the sake of clarity a little order into the many and various notions evoked by the word law. The material world is governed by laws, to which we, as physical beings, are necessarily subject. If, for instance, I am hoisted into the air and support is withdrawn from me, I must fall, in just the same way as an apple falls. Our submission to these laws is absolute, and let me not be told that science frees us from them, when in fact all the successful discoveries are in essence only an intelligent and profitable submission to these very laws. When we talk of the natural laws of society, we come at once to something quite different. A population of nomadic shepherds, for instance, whose pastures are ruined by drought, must emigrate. But in this case the necessity is not, as in the former, a mechanical one. The population may refrain from emigrating, and die in consequence. Lastly, we come to laws our submission to which is neither mechanical nor vital, to the moral law which it lies in our power to violate, and to the civil law which it lies in our power to transgress. The moral law prescribes what is good absolutely, the civil law what is useful to society. The positive legislation of a society buttresses with sanctions these prescriptions of the good and the useful, while paying attention to the necessary subordination of the useful to the good. We see, then, that government by the laws is, in essence, that in which those rules are sanctioned which are of useful effect to men dedicated to the good. They are set in a framework which is determined, generally, by the physical laws of nature and, especially, by the natural laws of society. When power confines itself to enforcing respect for those laws, the individual moves over ground on which there are both barriers erected and roads marked, but on which, on condition that he respects those barriers and follows those roads, he is free, in the sense that no human will can, by a sudden and arbitrary intervention, disturb his plans and constrain his will. He is recognized as being the master of his fate and responsible for it. He has a consecrated dignity. Human infirmity, no doubt, will always stand between us and the complete realization of such a system as this. Our power of discerning the good is not flawless and, still more, our ability to anticipate the useful is unequal to taking into account all possible circumstances. Our laws, in consequence, can never be of an absolutely unalterable and immutable character. Unceasing vigilance is needed to provide for particular cases, and wisdom must from time to time take a hand in revising the rules. Yet it is certain that this vigilance carried to excess and these interventions multiplied unduly will diminish the liberty and dignity of the individual. The conclusion is, then, that government by the laws, undiluted, is in its perfection unrealizable, but remains ever the model and the touchstone, the myth and the inspiration. The cause of social order and human dignity is best served when this ideal is made the goal. We may say of each successive society which has crossed the stage of civilization that it has, at one moment in its career, drawn near to this perfection, but only to sheer off again before long and to move headlong towards arbitrariness in government and servility in the hearts of the subjects. Of the various reasons for this, it will be sufficient to enumerate a few. First is the fact that the interplay of positive laws deemed the most adequate still leaves only too much for scores of individual miseries and misfortunes. This feature of human laws need not occasion much surprise to the public man when its presence in the divine law is freely admitted by the theologian. But it would be asking too much of the victims to expect so serene a spirit in them. They desire, nay, they demand, a providential intervention to mend the consequences of their misfortunes. This variable of present discontents is liable to take on sudden accretions at certain periods, either because, owing to a change in the actual circumstances of life, the civil law ceases to supply the needs of society in a satisfactory manner, or because, through a change in the psychological outlook of individuals, what was previously regarded as satisfactory is no longer so regarded, or for reasons which are still more serious, that men deny the need to subordinate the useful to the good and, taking the view that the useful is the good, in that way break the connecting chain which keeps in coherence the various kinds of laws, or again because, flown with a false conceit of human capabilities, they think themselves endowed with power to abrogate the natural laws of society by means of positive laws. It may happen that all these reasons will be found working together, and it is in fact the lesson of history that they are usually found in conjunction. Between them they furnish dormant ambition with a wonderful opportunity for putting life into power, and for restoring to it those aggressive and arbitrary characteristics of which its nature partakes. It goes without saying that, thanks to the ingrained habit of legality, the interventions on which power now embarks take on at first the form of laws. But these are but counterfeit laws, concerned only to provide for the situations of the moment, owning the imperious sway of current passions and requirements. Under the cloak of objective legislation, every subjective desire enjoys a saturnalia, as is shown both by the rapidity and the inconsistency with which these so-called laws multiply. Principle and certitude are things of the past, the desires of the moment become your only lawgiver, no respecters these of the notions of moral good and natural necessity, which they confound with that of utility in its most transitory shape. Utility itself has come to mean, not the permanent utility of society as a whole, but the passing utility of a sectional group which accommodates virtue and knowledge to its interests and passions. Whatever pretensions are made that this is the way to be of service to man, the fact remains that he thereby loses all liberty and all dignity. For he can now no longer plan his course by reference to any given certainties, and the knowledge that any active of his own will avail him much less than to stand well with power disposes him towards ambition of a servile kind, to be of those who are in touch with the author of all miracles, to be a beneficiary of arbitrariness. Would anyone dare to deny that this is the general tendency of our time? And is not its danger patent? Very strong inclinations are at work on its behalf. Where the idea comes from that men hold despotism in detestation, I do not know. My own view is that they delight in it. We need look no further than at the fortunes which they embark in games of chance, Paris mutuals, and lotteries, to measure the extent of the glamour which the hope of a casual increment holds for them, as well as of the sacrifices which they are ready to make to give themselves a chance of gaining it. Now arbitrary power is a lottery of a kind, and there are prizes in it for the fortunate. Or look at the novels, plays, films, and news items which have a popular success, it will be found that here, too, there is a very wide demand for events, shows, and characters which are out of the common run. Arbitrary power answers to this need. In this way human nature makes straight the way for the coming of arbitrary power, the summons to which is given, as it was sure to be, by the tasks committed to the social protectorate. 3. The modern problem and its absurd solution. We will now try to expound in a series of simple propositions the problem in our own time. Firstly, the social evil to which a remedy is sought in the institution of the protectorate is no imaginary evil. In the vast industrial complex there is, in a very real sense, a failure in the adjustment and correlation of the relations between the parties which cries out for correction. And there is also a widespread discontent, due to the conviction that the complex does not distribute to each his fair social share. Secondly, anyone supposing that adequate remedies can be found within the framework of the legalitarian system, by means of one of those applications of positive exactments to new situations which are from time to time necessary in such a system, will find that it is impossible in practice to make an application of that kind effective. For the new laws required would need to be the fruit of enlightened study and meditation. Whereas in fact legislative activity, as it is called, is nothing better than the hurried botching of short-sighted interests and blind passions. So that, thirdly, these outpourings of so-called laws are in reality merely so many acts of government, busy in its daily task of coping with the day's situations. Power in any case, whether it keeps or spurns the thin disguise of legality, proceeds in fact by way of arbitrary decisions. Fourthly, the arbitrary power, swept on by the passions of the mob and swayed by the ardors of the holders of office, lacking rule and bit and limit, constitutes, for all its tinsel dresses, a despotism such as the West has never known before. It is none the less dangerous for being unstable. All despotisms have been unstable. As none is outside its power, it makes for servility. As every conquest is open to it, it breeds ambition. And, lastly, the demand for order, with which we began, ends in letting loose disorder on a gigantic scale. At this point we should be justified in bringing our investigation to a close, for we have done what we set out to do. We aimed at explaining the successive stages of power's growth and its monstrous efflorescence that is now before our eyes. The inquiry is finished, the dossier is complete, the reasons have been made good and the consequences foreshadowed. Yet we cannot bring ourselves to leave the subject without pillorying the error which is guiding our epic to the absurd solution of making general disorder the remedy for particular disorders. It should be clearly understood, however, that this supplement to our investigation is no more than a rapid and superficial glimpse of another vast field of study which we hope one day to explore. Let us, in this spirit, go back to the various phenomena of social and moral disharmony which in our own time favor the rise of absolute power. 4. The miracle of confidence. The entire existence of man in society rests on confidence. The stranger whom we meet constitutes no menace either to our persons or to our property. We see in him, on the contrary, one of those countless anonymous fellow workers who guarantee to us the daily satisfaction of needs which have in the course of centuries gradually multiplied. Nor do we rely only on his negative virtues, as when we leave valuable objects in the care of whoever happens to be our neighbor, our well-being depends on his active cooperation as well, as when we trust ourselves to the diligence of a host of intermediaries to get a message through to its destination and to get for us at every hour of the day our necessaries of life. Our security turns on the admirable regularity with which a whole host of services is rendered to us by a countless number of members of the same society who do not know us and whom we do not know. We, too, play our part, but its efficaciousness and value are due to all the parts being concerted. The mind slips all too easily into the passive acceptance of this harmonious working. Once meditated on, it becomes both astonishing and admirable, and is sufficient proof that each for all and all for each is not the motto of an improbable utopia but the formula of society and being. Think of the ensuing disaster if a railway signalman leaves for only an hour his normal course of conduct. Nor is his case in any way exceptional, though it is certainly one to strike the imagination. Each single irregularity causes a shock, and the machine can only function at all so long as the peccant behaviors do not exceed in number the lowest margin which it can rectify in its stride. Irregularity on a widespread scale would bring our species to an end, for there is no individual who can provide for his own needs. So aware are we of this that, even when faced with disturbance on the most colossal scale, we immediately and instinctively start to tie up again the threads which bombardment or insurrection have broken. But how, you ask, has the division of labor come about? How have men fallen into their several divisions, and how is the necessary internal adjustment brought about? One possible answer, the first that occurs to men in general, is that it is the work of a single will. There is a wide variety of myths, the systematic study of which is still, unfortunately, to be undertaken, explaining the functional division of men into different categories with each of which there goes along a certain type of behavior. This form of social organization, say the myths, has been decreed by one particular lawgiver, demiurge, hero, or even fabulous animal, as the case may be, so that slavish adherence to the traditional behavior is the fruit of veneration and fear. In one myth the ordering of all things, natural and social, is represented as a combined and simultaneous operation. In another, on the other hand, it is recognized that objects which are incapable of the act of willing are not regulated in the same way as are human beings. Human beings are allowed by this myth to have had their own particular teacher, who ceases in time to arouse any superstitious veneration. At that stage the myth degenerates into something worse than the mythical, false history. Since, it is said, the organization of society is the work of a man, it is open to other men, if they please, to rebuild it on other foundations. Thus to the superstitious horror of change succeeds naturally a belief in the possibility of any change whatsoever. The fixationist error has given birth to its contrary, the utopian error. The reason is that ideas are still bound by the same conception of the social order being subject to a will. By the time that the legalitarian conception makes its appearance, the development of human intelligence has proceeded a certain distance. Its starting point is the affirmation that, on the analogy of the laws of nature, human society also has its natural laws. With these the social order is secured and preserved, they mend it without ceasing and in doing so complicate it no less continuously. Whatever the other merits of this thesis, it is in its concrete applications vitiated partly by the hasty assimilation of the forces which move men to the forces of nature, and partly by an inability, for which there is some excuse, to distinguish between the laws which govern objects without souls and those which control beings who have received liberty and will. The upshot of it is a tendency to quietism. Epitomized, these 2 points of view, the voluntarist and the quietist, issue in the ordinary conceptions of socialism and liberalism respectively, which do not merit discussion. No positive study has yet been made of the means by which the harmony of society is maintained and mended, nor can there be any question of making one here. All that can be done will be to give certain indications, which will be developed elsewhere and, where necessary, revised. 5. Concepts of right conduct. Let us begin in a small way by considering any given man in society, fulfilling any given function and pursuing any given line of behavior. He suggests naturally to the mind the image of a mobile object describing a given curve. What is the force which binds him to this curve and causes him to follow this trajectory? Egoism, answers the school of Hobbes and Helvetius, concern for his own self-interest. From that starting point every social institution has been explained as an emanation of the natural and necessary complex of egoistical interests. Intellectually, nothing could be finer than some of the workings out of this theory, and it would be ridiculous to impugn the intentions of its authors. What attracted them to this hypothesis was the desire, coming naturally to savants, to find in the moral order one simple principle corresponding to energy in the physical order. However reluctant we might be to accept their assumption, we should be in their debt if they had really succeeded in building a coherent structure. But they have not done so, and the only way which they have found of making egoisms the instrument of the common good is by endowing them with calculations which show a more human degree of enlightenment. But men take short views where their interests are concerned, and this fact leads our philosophers to secure by constraint the order which the reason is too feeble to establish. Starting from the all-sufficient efficaciousness of egoism, they reach the necessity of repression, to which in the end they ascribe a most exaggerated role. This twofold misconception, of basing social order either on enlightened self-interest or on repressive constraint, is due to defective observation. Neither the most far-sighted calculation nor fear of punishment determines to any marked extent the conduct of man in the concrete, either in what he does or in what he refrains from doing. His actions are governed by feelings and beliefs which dictate to him his behavior and inspire his impulses. Not a man of us asks himself, when the time comes for us each day to go out into the fields, or the factory, or the office, shall I go or not? Just as none asks himself, seeing a child in danger, shall I save it or not? Or, seeing a neighbor fingering a well-filled wallet, shall I take it from him or not? Man is an animal made for life in society. The intelligent awareness of our interests and the fear of punishment are but complementary forces, which are useful for checking the occasional aberration. But such occasions are infrequent. In general we behave as good neighbors and scrupulous cooperators, for that to us is second nature, a nature which has moreover grown in the soil of a sociability and benevolence which should not be underestimated. And now how does this nature work? He would be a bold man who claimed to have the explanation of it, yet it seems clear to me that it works by way of concepts. Common speech often provides the key to the workings of psychology, and when we say, I do not see myself doing something or other, we are revealing that we are controlled by concepts of right conduct. In childhood a host of educational influences played their part in forming these concepts. Not only parents and teachers and priests and masters, but some fellow pupil whom we admire, some colleague who attracts us, some dead man whose example stirs us. What may be called social heredity operates here with a power incomparably greater than that physical heredity. The family into which we are born, the country to which we belong, the career on which we enter, all these have for us an immense power of suggestion. All that is around us whispers to us our duty, we have but to copy and repeat. The conduct always seen around us and the actions always held up for our admiration provide our spirit with models which we follow without thinking. Even on their deathbeds, some of the greatest men have repeated formulas and gestures which they have taken from history or poetry. These potent concepts are the guides to our behavior. It is they which make it calculable to our fellows and compatible with their behaviors. It is they which maintain the social harmony. 6. On the regulation of society. From this it follows that, whenever the current concepts of right conduct are disturbed, the social harmony is in danger. Disturbance may happen even in a fossilized society, in which the same tasks and the same employments have been shared in the same proportions for generations. And it happens almost inevitably in a rapidly developing society, in which new functions and new ways of life are continually coming into being. Take the first case. Each new arrival in such a society, in whatever situation and social employment, arrives as a successor already formed by example and teaching. He has served his apprenticeship, whether as a medieval mason or as a Roman emperor, at the side of the man he is to replace. His duty is a simple one, though all the same he may prove unequal to it, that is the phenomenon of the decay of folkways, a theme to which the ancient authorities devoted a most intelligent attention. The debasement of religious beliefs may set it in motion, accompanied by a rationalist outbreak which fastens on all the determinants of behavior, gives every proof of its inability to replace them, and ushers in the reign of intellectual anarchy. But the trouble may also be caused by the corruption of the ruling classes, a corruption which leads to the rupture of the true social contract, that, namely, by which each man behaves in character with his functional type on condition that everyone else with whom he has relations acts in character with his. In those conditions irregularity of conduct spreads from top to bottom, and in many cases the intellectual upheaval is little more than the consequence of the moral, for it is part of the average man's make-up to feel religious doubts on account of doubts concerning his bishop rather than to feel doubts concerning his bishop on account of religious doubts. And so, even in a fossilized society, harmony is destroyed. Far more difficult is the task of maintaining it, or rather of unceasingly restoring it, in a developing society, in which there is a continuous addition of new activities to old, bringing new behaviors in their train and making necessary the adaptation of such of the old as they do not directly modify. Once the complexity of the problem is grasped, the functional disorders which in fact occur in a developing society seem less matter for surprise than the high degree of adjustment secured it by a hidden automatism. The admiration felt by the men of the 19th century for self-regulating mechanisms is understandable, but these disorders explain how it is that in the end an accumulation of troubles comes to exceed the tolerable limit, especially if the mechanisms are in continuous process of losing their virtue. These mechanisms are much misconceived, for the study of them has hardly begun. How so? You say, have not the economists analyzed meticulously the delicate interplay of forces? True enough, but there lies the mistake, in thinking that the whole problem in its entirety falls within the province of the economists. Economists can explain to us the way in which a growing supply of automobiles lessens progressively the demand for horses and carriages until these completely disappear, in which automobile factories absorb the men engaged in coachmaking and saddlery and draw in more besides, in which stables are transformed into garages. But when the process of quantitative adaptation has been brought to its inevitable perfection, there remains outstanding the whole of the infinitely more important question of qualitative adaptation. Between a master saddler living above his workshop in the Temple Quarter, and his son lost in the nameless and cosmopolitan crowd of citron workers and living in a suburb, there has been a prodigious transformation of folkways, beliefs, and sentiments, a transformation which cannot but leave its mark on the whole tone of society and in the end even affect the interplay of supply and demand. What makes it possible for political economy to be a science at all is that it looks on social life, and all the activities, relationships, and satisfactions of human beings, as the regular flow of one and the same energy, sometimes, as in the case of labor, active, sometimes, as in the case of wealth, potential but homogeneous and always measurable in units of value. But the very feature which makes a science of it makes it incapable of explaining the whole of social reality, or even of taking account of all the phenomena which occur within its proper sphere. It reveals the reasons for which local savings are diverted from accounts kept locally by local bankers, as in former days they were, and are attracted into vast central reservoirs from which they are distributed nationally and even internationally. But it is no part of its business to stress the fact that the manipulators of savings are now not the same set of men, and that the old and the new types are quite different, in nothing more unlike than in their respective concepts of right conduct. It justifies the money market as a useful piece of regulative machinery, but is not concerned to know what temperaments it attracts and what characters it develops. It is a valuable science, but one grafted onto a false psychology, which regards the race of men as a physical mass pinpointed in place and acted upon only by the mechanical force of self-interest. Hence it is that the point of view of the economist is the worst of all for discerning social disharmonies. These must react on quantitative adaptations before they receive his attention. That is what in the end happened. Disturbance in the sphere of economic functions appeared as a sort of tertiary ague compelling attention to a social disease which had been long in progress. 7. New functions necessitate new constraining concepts. This disease takes the form of a social vociferousness, of a defective medley of inharmonious behaviors. These are occasioned by the disturbance, which goes along with the evolution of society, of the concepts of right conduct, and there is delay in finding substitutes which are at once sufficiently clear-cut and sufficiently binding to guide mankind when they find themselves in novel situations. Men become the natural prey of interests which, even when restrained by the fear of penal sanctions, show themselves impotent to procure harmonious behaviors. The phenomenon of being thrown out of his element and out of gear is substantially the same whether it is a case of a peasant being flung into a factory or of a small employee becoming a big speculator. It is not merely, as has sometimes been said, the too rapid change of condition which constitutes the essential danger, but rather that, on reaching their new condition, the men who have either got on or been uprooted are without concepts of right conduct to prompt them in their new parts. They retain, no doubt, certain moral ideas, which they learnt in childhood. But casuistry, which means the application of general precepts to particular situations, is a difficult art and only for the few. And so long as there is no code of practical rules suited to any given condition, general principles by themselves are impotent. The task of elaborating this code of rules is not the business of the legislative authority, which cannot go into details of that kind. It is no director of consciences. It belongs to the creators of the new conditions, to the innovating elites, guided to the extent needed by the spiritual authorities, to create the code of behavior and the concepts of right conduct which are needed to harmonize the new function with the order of society. These innovating elites must consider, while innovating, the personnel whom they attract, and make ready for their reception frameworks of morals as well as the raw materials of their work. Each function, in a word, has its law of chivalry and its duty of leadership. In the social movement of today, the innovators have neither elaborated these laws nor been conscious of these duties. 8. Social authorities without ethical codes. Let us look at some actual cases. The man who thought of the bearer share of low nominal value made possible the association of small and medium savings with large-scale economic enterprises. The role of the financiers who mobilized the people's savings was a very beneficent one on two conditions. First, that the enterprises on whose behalf they raised the capital were advantageous to the community, and secondly that they had a care for the security of the savers. It would be unfair to deny that many financiers have been conscious of this double responsibility, but no such binding financial ethic has ever been constructed as to keep every financier without exception in the narrow path. On the contrary, an ever-growing irresponsibility has marked this particular category of society. The annals of capitalism show instances of numerous issues which have had no other aim than that of robbing the investors, by, for example, selling them a limited liability concern at a price well above its true value, watering the stock, provoking an exaggerated fall in the price of the shares, and then buying them in at a low price. Even apart from the numerous instances of devices which are openly fraudulent, there are many others in which the promoters are quite indifferent as to both the security of the capital and the purposes to which it is put, their sole concern being their own brokerage and commission. They justify their indifference by two notions, both of them false. The first is that the extent of the flow of capital towards a particular enterprise is determined by its profitability, which in turn measures its social utility and the need for its extension, conclusions which are quite erroneous, being based on an ill-founded confidence in economic automatism. The second is that the promoter of an issue contracts on equal terms with the investor. This is one of the absurd consequences of the egalitarian fiction which is the presiding genius of modern law. Now let us pass on to the industrialist who, fortified by a vast provision of capital, opens a large factory. In his capacity as a supplier of goods and employment he is a social benefactor, but only, of course, on the two conditions that the goods supplied are useful and that he is conscious of his responsibility for the fate of the army of workers which he musters. The first of these two preoccupations is, unfortunately, removed from him by the utterly false dogma that demand is the measure of utility, whatever the way in which this demand is stimulated, and even if it is the fruit of an impudent publicity. As for the second, it gets dispensed with by the fiction of equality. The industrialist is not now the lord, protector, and guardian of those who are to work in his service, but only a man who contracts on equal terms with equals. Hence came the 19th century's folly of supposing that the obligations of contract were the long and short of the obligations of the employer to his men. Anyone studying the case law and legislation relating to industrial accidents will think himself in a madhouse as he contemplates the legal fictions to which recourse has had to justify the responsibility of the employer, a responsibility which should, on the contrary, have flowed naturally from the positive recognition of the duties inherent in an economic overlordship carrying with it all the obligations of protection and help. Next we come to the proprietor of the popular newspaper. Such a man is not a mere seller of paper in obedience to a popular demand, he is, rather, a propagator of opinions, an awakener of emotions, a builder or destroyer of concepts of right conduct. Yet, from the day that the first halfpenny paper was launched until now, the big circulations have never built up an ethic. The spread of education, which was designed to counteract the consequences of universal suffrage by providing the citizens with the minimum of knowledge necessary to enable them to form sensible opinions, has in fact furnished the purveyors of cheap emotion with an inexhaustible reservoir of consumers. To superficial minds, the only point of consequence lies in the direct influence exercised by the press on the course of politics, but that is not the essential feature of the phenomenon. It is, rather, the propagation of concepts of right conduct which are antisocial and the habit of emotional processes of thought which it engenders. The shock administered to good manners by the press, not unassisted by the film, is almost incalculable. And the journalist world, though much more honest in the narrower sense than is often thought, is quite unconscious of its responsibility in the wider. One more example, that of the publicity agent, the worker in persuasion, who hires his services to all comers whether he gives the public a taste for patent medicines which are either actively harmful or completely useless, or teaches them habits which may do them harm, or propagates destructive political principles, a form of advertisement which is called, for short, propaganda. 9. Consequences of a false conception of society. To sum up this cursory tour d'horizon, it is clear enough that the financier, the industrialist, the journalist, and the publicity agent, even when they are perfectly decent people, are all guilty of social misbehavior, for the simple reason that they have no professional code which is sufficiently precise and binding to canalize their activities towards social ends. The unedifying character of such codes and concepts of right conduct as they have is due in part to the rapidity of society's evolution. But a further and much more important reason is the lack of spiritual and social authorities. The task of the spiritual authorities should be to keep close on the tail of the evolution of society, and to formulate specific obligations, flowing naturally from moral truths of universal extent, for each situation as it arises. It is a pure waste of time to preach in a church frequented by stock jobbers the rules formulated for a patriarchal peasantry. After listening respectfully, the stock jobbers will go away without having received the smallest guidance for life. But the assurance needed to play so active a role is lacking to spiritual authorities whose title deeds are in dispute and who in consequence fall back defensively on the mere performance of ceremonial. The task of those who are for practical purposes rulers, leaders, employers, squires, and guides of the people, should be to take good care where they are going and whither they are leading. But in fact, the words ruler and leader are not applied to them, they are denied this style and title. The false dogma of equality, so flattering to the weak, results in practice in a chartered libertinism for the strong. At no time in history has social elevation carried with it fewer obligations, or actual inequality proved more oppressive, than since the incorporation in positive law of inequality in principle, bringing in its train the negation of all the duties that belong to station. What we now see are the developing consequences of hasty thinking, which has refused to see in the mechanism of society anything except the individual men and women who make it, and a central mainspring, the state. Everything else it has disregarded, and the role of the spiritual and social authorities has been denied. There were intellectual reasons for this mistake. Into a new sort of studies was carried the presumption of an adolescent science, grown drunk on Newton, which could see in the whole universe nothing but the simple play of elemental forces. And there were political reasons too. The state and the individual were just emerging triumphant from their long struggle waged in common against the social authorities, which were hateful to the one as rivals and to the other as tyrants. How would they share the spoils between themselves? Either the individual would reap all the benefit of a twofold enfranchisement, the individualist solution, or else the state would be heir to the functions hitherto filled by the now banished authorities, the etatist solution. The 19th century essayed at first the first of these solutions, power, which had no master, mastered itself, trusting to the interplay of individual interests to bring about the best of all orders, a spontaneous order. We have seen how, thanks to this forbearance, new social authorities sprang into the saddle, unrecognized as such and finding in the foolish denial of their existence the opportunity for doing infinite mischief. And we have witnessed, too, the appearance of the most fantastic candidates to spiritual authority. The most moth-eaten heresies have reappeared in the guise of new ideas, and around them have sprung up those militant and aggressive churches, the parties of today. The result has been that in the end the insolence of interests and the confusion of beliefs have made necessary the restoration of some sort of order. The only available disciplinary authority being power, it has had to have conferred on it an unlimited restraining capacity. 10. From chaos to totalitarianism. Leaders of groups, such as the feudal baron or the captain of industry, have always existed in every society known to history and will continue to be in every conceivable society. This fact carries with it a twofold responsibility for the leaders, as to the harmonizing of the group with the whole and as to the well-being of the group. Both these responsibilities are natural ones, they continue just the same even if positive law neglects them or refuses to give them countenance. Similarly, there are in each social authority, whether ancient or modern, those who set the pace and lay down standards of behavior, the elders, whose responsibility it is, it too, a natural one, to set an example. There are many different species of notables, and there are elders for each of the many roles played in the drama of society. No social order could either maintain or restore itself if the controllers of groups and masters of colleges cease to carry out their essential purpose, to which the spiritual authority must continually recall them. It is an idle metaphysic that denies their existence and treats them as ordinary citizens. It results, not in suppressing their authority and influence, but only in freeing them from the honorable disciplines which make them the servants of the common good. On interest becoming their only principle of action, the very men whose duty it is to secure order spread disorder. The troubling of the concepts of right conduct spreads from top to bottom, and individuals, whatever their stations and functions, lose the precise and detailed picture of their duties on which their effectiveness as fellow workers depends. When that happens, cohesion can be restored to society only by powers formulating in the greatest detail the rules of behavior which are appropriate to each separate function. And since habits and folkways, those powerful internal regulators of the concepts of right conduct, have ceased to bring about a spontaneous conformity, conformity must be secured by repression. But repression cannot be made effective at every turn and everywhere, that would need as many policemen as there are citizens. Therefore it is sought to supply the defect of external compulsion by a form of constraint which is really the most efficacious of all, that which the form of a man's own conscience exercises over his actions. Concepts of right conduct are put into him from without, for which purpose use must be made of the squalid weapons of mass suggestion and propaganda. The upshot is squalid concepts, undifferentiated by reference to function, as those which spring from moral influences and observed examples are differentiated. The social cohesion created in this way is of a far rougher and more primitive kind than the one which has been allowed to perish. The divergences which troubled society are diminished, but at the price of the differences which gave it its civilization. This is the totalitarian solution, an evil called into being by the individualist evil, for the contrary of an error is not truth but only another error. The fruits of individualist rationalism. From not having known how to preserve, and from not knowing how to restore, the delicate and living harmony of a highly civilized society, we are returning to the form of cohesion which is that of the primitive tribe. Out of common frenzies are forged powerful sentiments, comporting with their totems and taboos, for failure to feel which the penalty is to be treated as a hostis or foreign enemy. What would the individualists and freethinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries say could they but see what idols a man must now worship, to what jackboots he must now pay homage, if he is to escape being hunted and stoned? Would not the superstition which they fought seem to them the very acme of enlightenment, compared with the superstitions which have taken its place? And how mild is the despotism which they threw off by the side of those which are now crushing us? So careful of the individual life, so delighting in refinement of manners, so critical of the criminal law's severity, so scandalized by legal injustice, think of the horror with which they would compare the society which made them with the society which they have made. For, however strong an attraction individualist ideas may have for us, it must be admitted that it is impossible to condemn totalitarian regimes without also condemning the destructive metaphysic which made their happening a certainty. This metaphysic refused to see in society anything but the state and the individual. It disregarded the role of the spiritual authorities and of all those intermediate social forces which inframe, protect, and control the life of man, thereby obviating and preventing the intervention of power. It did not foresee that the overthrow of all these barriers and bulwarks would unleash a disorderly rout of egoistical interests and blind passions leading to the fatal and inauspicious coming of tyranny. Tocqueville, Comte, Taine, and many another redoubled their warnings in vain. Were all the prophecies poured out by so many of the finer spirits to be set down in sequence, a whole book would be the result. Useless Cassandras. And why so useless? Perhaps societies are governed in their onward march by laws of which we are ignorant. Do we know whether it is their destiny to avoid the mortal errors which beset them? Or whether they are not led into them by the same dynamism which carried them to their prime? Whether their seasons of blossom and fruitfulness are not achieved at the cost of a destruction of the forms in which their strength was stored? After the firework display, the darkness of a formless mass, Destined to Despotism or Anarchy. Epilogue. Written by the translator. Encouraged thereto by the author, I am minded to write a few sentences of my own on a work which has occupied so of much of my time. This book ranges over the great open spaces of place and time, but its kernel can be bounded in a nutshell. It is a study of the expansionism of power at the hands of men of great place, called throughout les dirigeants. At the root of power is force, and its ultimate appeal is to the egoistical side of men. From the resulting deterioration in themselves and their policies, the dirigeant can be saved, if completely, only through the undeviating acknowledgement of an absolute code, which neither they nor their supporters made or can alter, but which can instantly deprive of all validity, other than that given by force, their own laws and ordinances. Lex iniqua non habet rationem legis. The words beat like drum taps, but their sound is often low through the grinding of political axes. The people can, for all of Durkheim's advocacy, do wrong, and, when a majority holds power over a minority, justice may as easily as with a despot turn to being the interest of the stronger, unless they, or he, keep a vigilant and instructed conscience which impels to the unquestioning recognition of the obligatory character of the objective moral code. They made it known, wrote Acton of the Stoics, that there is a will superior to the collective will of man and a law that overrules those of Solon and Lycurgus. That which we must obey, that to which we are bound to reduce all civil authorities and to sacrifice every earthly interest, is that immutable law which is perfect and eternal as God Himself. Ideas such as these were once the commonplaces of Western Europe, the nations of which now resemble nothing so much as Athens and Thebes and Sparta bickering in the shadow of Macedonia, with Trieste or Salonika cast for the part of Olynthus. But we at our time have changed all that. Disliking the minority rule of one person, or even of three, we have increasingly organized ourselves in the light of our mass recipes for what a statesman, heaven help us, has called the science of happiness. We have, said an eloquent and progressive French orator of some 40 years ago in a much applauded peroration, pulled down the stars from heaven. He would be thwarted no longer. Recent events confirm the teaching of earlier ones as to the capacity for sin of dirigeants, whose oratory is still expended on the soundness of the people's heart, the general will, and in exalting, for purposes more their own than his, the moral and intellectual competence of the ordinary man. They praise my lord such a one's horse when they mean to steal it, therefore it is now said of him whatever he vicariously decrees or decides, under whatever pressure of emotion or interest, is as good law as God's, if he has but decreed or decided it by a sufficient majority. To this claim it must be replied, as the book makes reply, that power, even when based on popular sovereignty at its broadest, is still not God, that the natural law need never justify itself to any man, to any assembly, or to any tribunal, that neither the largest of majorities nor the most powerful of despots can ever meet it on its own ground, that, I assure, Antigone was right and Creon wrong, notwithstanding Hegel's attempt to confuse that particular issue. The angels fell from spiritual pride, and the people would be well advised to stop their ears against the exaltation of their merits by seekers after power, else their ultimate disaster will be the greater. From the power-bred instinct of dirigeants to persuade their subjects that they are the only providers of the best of a wide variety of worlds, the tendency to confound categories by conferring on words the meanings best suited to the user's purposes has taken vigorous wing. Upon corruption of will has been piled obfuscation of intellect. One of the first casualties in times of discord is, as Thucydides noted, the meanings of words, and to the Thucydidean list of inexactitudes it is time to add the current equation of liberty with security and the possession of a vote, of justice with equality as, too often, envy has conceived it to material ends, of idealism with the not always disinterested exaggeration of man's moral capacity, and of democratic with whatever the user of the word happens to approve. Humpty Dumpty has succeeded to the chair of more precise thinkers. The remedy for which the author calls is simple to state, but none the easier on that account to compass, being in fact the return to the acknowledgement of a code which is not relative to some contemporary set of interests and pressures, but lives and moves beyond time's troubled fountains on the great Atlantic mountains. This process is, whatever else, certainly different in kind from the standard preoccupations of displacing this ruler by that, raising to power that state or class or party in preference to this, and substituting one piece of political or economic machinery for another, all to the sound of self-appreciative chatter. Debe more morti, and now an almost simultaneous doom. In less lethal times Clemenceau could at least predict the survival of a few Negroes in the Congo, is, if we may believe half we hear, quite possibly round the next corner. The planetary epitaph, if the gin gets really out, should be in these terms only. We have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. Hi Josimus. The end.